Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through darkness and light, through ordinary days and extraordinary terrors. Tonight, we will travel together through the strange history of Hawkins, Indiana, a small town where the veil between worlds proved thinner than anyone imagined. As you settle into your comfortable space, let the gentle flow of this timeline carry you into peaceful dreams. Every era holds its own mysteries, its own heroes waiting to be discovered. This is a story of friendship forged in basements over fantasy games, of courage found in the most unlikely hearts, of a parallel dimension that existed alongside our own since time immemorial. We will explore how an ordinary Midwestern town became the epicenter of impossible discoveries, how children on bicycles faced horrors that governments could not contain, and how love in all its forms proved stronger than the shadows that sought to consume everything. So let us start at the beginning, long before the children of Hawkins Middle School would face impossible choices, in a time when the place that would become this quiet community existed in two forms simultaneously. Long before Hawkins, Indiana appeared on any map, before America itself was named, the place that would become this quiet town existed in two forms. The world we know, with its forests and rolling hills, its streams and fertile soil, occupied one plane of existence. Alongside it, separated by barriers invisible and incomprehensible, lay the dark reflection that would later be named the Upside Down. This parallel dimension, frozen in perpetual twilight, covered with creeping vines and floating particles, existed outside normal time and space. Whether it was created by some ancient event or had always existed, remained one of its deepest mysteries. The Upside Down waited patiently through countless ages. Its atmosphere, toxic to human life, supported creatures that belonged to no earthly classification. The landscape mirrored our world in structure, but not in essence. Every feature twisted into nightmare versions of ordinary geography. Trees grew gnarled and lifeless. The sky, if it could be called that, roiled with perpetual storm clouds, illuminated by distant lightning. The temperature remained constant, neither hot nor cold, but deeply uncomfortable to any living thing from our dimension. Most significantly, the realm possessed a form of consciousness, or connected to one, that would later be understood as the Mind Flayer. Indigenous peoples who inhabited the region centuries before European settlement may have sensed something unusual about the land. Their folklore, passed through generations, spoke of places where the earth felt wrong, where animals refused to venture, where visions came to those who spent too long in certain groves. Whether these stories reflected actual awareness of the dimensional boundary or simply represented universal human responses to isolated spaces remains uncertain. What is clear is that no documented contact with the Upside Down occurred during these early centuries. The barrier between worlds held firm, impermeable to human consciousness or physical form. European settlers arrived in the early 19th century, drawn by the promise of fertile farmland and abundant water. The area that would become Hawkins developed slowly, a collection of homesteads that gradually coalesced into a proper community. By 1850, Hawkins had been officially established, named after an early settler whose family had prospered through grain cultivation. The town grew modestly through the remainder of the century, adding a general store, a church, a one-room schoolhouse. Life followed patterns familiar throughout the American Midwest. Farmers worked the land, children attended school when harvest permitted. Families built modest prosperity through hard work and community cooperation. The 20th century brought gradual modernization to Hawkins. Electricity arrived in the 1920s, transforming evenings from candlelit darkness to electric brightness. The town expanded beyond its original boundaries, as successful farms generated wealth that flowed into local businesses. A proper downtown emerged with a bank, a diner, shops catering to both daily needs and modest luxuries. The Great Depression hit Hawkins as it hit all rural communities, bringing hardship but not devastation. The town's agricultural foundation provided basic sustenance even when money disappeared. World War II sent Hawkins' sons to distant battlefields, their names eventually carved into the memorial that would stand in the town square. Post-war prosperity transformed Hawkins more dramatically than previous changes. The GI Bill enabled veterans to attend college or purchase homes with government-backed mortgages. Suburban development began in earnest during the 1950s, tree-lined streets with modest houses replacing farmland at the town's edges. Young families moved into neighborhoods where children could play safely, where schools were being built to accommodate the baby boom generation. The population swelled from a few thousand to over 10,000 residents. New businesses opened to serve the growing community. A proper hospital replaced the doctor's office that had served for decades. A high school, modern and spacious, welcomed students who previously had to travel to neighbouring towns for education. Through all this growth and change, Hawkins remained fundamentally ordinary. It appeared in no guidebooks, offered no attractions to draw tourists, produced no notable products or famous residents. The town existed as thousands of similar communities existed across America, providing comfortable, if unremarkable, lives for people who valued stability over adventure. Children rode bicycles through safe neighborhoods. Teenagers attended football games and school dances. Adults worked modest jobs, attended church on Sundays, and saved for retirement. The most dramatic events were high school, championships, and the occasional scandal involving affairs or financial impropriety. This normalcy, this quintessential ordinariness, would later prove both Hawkins' camouflage and its vulnerability. By 1950, Hawkins had established itself as a typical American small town, the kind celebrated in postcards and Norman Rockwell paintings. Main Street featured local businesses owned by families who had lived in the area for generations. The annual 4th of July parade drew the entire community. Friday night football games provided social cohesion and entertainment. The library, small but well maintained, offered residents access to books and newspapers. The local government functioned efficiently, if unspectacularly, managing roads, schools, and basic services without corruption or controversy. Nothing about Hawkins suggested it would become anything other than what it appeared, a pleasant, forgettable place where nothing of historical significance would ever occur. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, the boundary between dimensions remained, unchanged by human development, indifferent to the town growing above it. The forests at Hawkins' edges, preserved by landowners who valued hunting and natural beauty, concealed the thinnest points, where worlds nearly touched. The quarry, carved by industry and then abandoned, created unintended geometric patterns that would later prove significant. The layout of streets, determined by practical considerations of terrain and property lines, formed shapes that had meaning in context beyond human awareness. Hawkins was being prepared, unknowingly, for the role it would play in bridging worlds that should never have met. The Cold War's paranoia and scientific ambition would soon bring new residents to Hawkins, researchers seeking answers to questions most dared not ask. The Department of Energy would arrive with promises of jobs and economic development, building a facility that would provide employment for hundreds, while conducting experiments the town could never imagine. The government's interest transformed Hawkins from anonymous farm town into strategic location, though few residents would understand this shift. The stage was being set for discoveries that would shatter the peaceful ordinariness Hawkins had cultivated for over a century. The end of World War II in 1945 brought not peace but a different kind of conflict, one fought in laboratories and mines rather than battlefields. The atomic age had dawned with mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, revealing possibilities both miraculous and terrifying. The subsequent Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union created an arms race that extended far beyond nuclear weapons into psychological warfare, unconventional research, and the exploration of human consciousness itself. This new conflict, waged in shadows and secrets, would transform Hawkins from anonymous farm town into a site of experiments that pushed the boundaries of science and ethics. The late 1940s saw unprecedented government investment in research facilities across America. Universities received grants for studies into radiation, psychology, and emerging technologies. Private companies partnered with military branches to develop new weapons and defensive capabilities. Remote locations became preferred sites for sensitive work, places where security could be maintained and local populations posed minimal risk of espionage or interference. Hawkins, with its isolation from major cities, its stable community unlikely to ask difficult questions, and its geographic features, fit these requirements perfectly. When Department of Energy representatives approached the town council in 1953 with proposals for a new research facility, they emphasized economic benefits and patriotic duty. The Hawkins National Laboratory broke ground in 1955 on land at the town's eastern edge, where forest met former farmland. Construction proceeded rapidly, employing local workers who appreciated steady paychecks and asked no questions about the facility's true purpose. The building rose from cleared earth, a modern structure of concrete and steel that contrasted sharply with Hawkins' traditional architecture. Multiple stories above ground housed administrative offices, equipment rooms, and laboratories for what appeared to be legitimate energy research. The Department of Energy insignia adorned official documents and uniforms, suggesting mundane investigations into power generation and efficiency. This public face satisfied town curiosity while concealing the facility's actual focus. Beneath the visible portions of Hawkins' lab, however, lay levels that never appeared on official blueprints. These underground chambers, carved deep into bedrock, contained the true experimental spaces. Reinforced walls provided both physical security and soundproofing. Specialized ventilation systems maintained controlled atmospheric conditions. Security checkpoints at each level ensured that only personnel with highest clearances could access the deepest sections. The basement levels grew more extensive than the structure above, a hidden complex where work that could never withstand public scrutiny would be conducted for decades. The town remained unaware that beneath their feet, separated by earth and concrete, lay spaces designed for experiments that would challenge every assumption about reality's nature. Dr. Martin Brenner arrived at Hawkins' lab in 1958, recruited from previous government research positions by promises of unlimited resources and freedom from ethical oversight that constrained university work. Brenner, whose academic credentials included advanced degrees in psychology and neuroscience, had distinguished himself in studies of human consciousness and perception. His theories about unlocking latent mental abilities through controlled stimulation had attracted attention from agencies interested in creating psychic weapons for Cold War deployment. The remote laboratory in Indiana offered him opportunity to pursue research that academic institutions would never approve, with subjects provided by government channels and protection from legal consequences should experiments produce unfortunate results. Under Brenner's direction, Hawkins' lab's research shifted from theoretical investigation into active human experimentation. The initial years focused on adult volunteers, individuals recruited through advertisements that promised payment for participation in psychological studies. These early subjects underwent sensory deprivation, psychedelic drug administration, and techniques designed to access supposedly dormant portions of the brain. The results proved mixed. Some subjects reported unusual perceptions or temporary enhancement of memory and focus. Most experienced nothing beyond disorientation and temporary psychological distress. A few suffered permanent damage, their minds unable to recover from the procedure's intensity. These failures were noted, the subjects compensated or institutionalized, and the research continued with modifications. By 1960, Hawkins' lab had become a permanent fixture in the community, providing employment for janitors, cafeteria workers, security guards, and administrative staff drawn from Hawkins' residents. These employees spoke proudly of their association with important government work, even though none understood the true nature of research conducted in sections they could never access. The lab contributed to the local economy through purchases of supplies and services. Dr. Brenner occasionally appeared at town functions, presenting the face of a dedicated scientist serving his country. The facility's integration into Hawkins' life made it simultaneously visible and invisible, present but unquestioned, generating employment and taxes, while its actual purposes remained completely hidden. The construction of sensory deprivation tanks in 1962 marked a significant advancement in the lab's capabilities. These chambers, filled with salt water, heated to body temperature, and designed to eliminate all external stimuli, allowed researchers to isolate consciousness from physical sensation. Subjects floating in absolute darkness, unable to hear, see, feel, taste, or smell anything, reported that time became meaningless and the boundaries between self and environment began dissolving. For most people, the experience proved merely unsettling. For a few, however, something remarkable happened. Their consciousness, freed from sensory input, began reaching beyond their bodies, touching thoughts and perceptions that should have been impossible to access. These rare individuals became the focus of Brenner's obsessive attention. The laboratory's growing isolation from oversight created conditions where ethical boundaries eroded steadily. Early experiments that required informed consent gave way to procedures where subjects understood little about what would be done to them. Volunteers recruited through legitimate channels were supplemented by individuals acquired through less transparent means. Brenner's philosophy that extraordinary scientific advancement required extraordinary measures justified increasingly questionable methods. He believed that unlocking human potential would provide America with decisive Cold War advantage, that telepathy and telekinesis could tip the balance of power between superpowers. This conviction, combined with government protection and remote location, created an environment where almost any experiment could be justified in pursuit of results. By the mid-1960s, Hawkins' lab had established protocols and infrastructure that would define its operation for the next 2 decades. Multiple levels of security ensured secrecy. Staff were compartmentalized, each knowing only their specific responsibilities. Subject recruitment expanded beyond local sources to include individuals from across the country brought to Indiana through channels that left no paper trail. The facility operated with near total autonomy, answering to shadowy government agencies that provided funding without asking uncomfortable questions about methodology. The town of Hawkins continued growing around this secret, its residents unaware that their community harbored experiments that would eventually tear the fabric of reality itself. As the 1960s progressed, the lab's research would take an even darker turn, influenced by government programs that pushed ethical boundaries in pursuit of Cold War advantage. The combination of Brenner's ambition, government funding, and complete lack of oversight created perfect conditions for tragedy. The children who would eventually become numbered subjects in pursuit of impossible powers were not yet born. The gate to another dimension remained sealed, but the foundation for catastrophe was being laid carefully, systematically, one unethical experiment at a time. The 1960s brought social upheaval to America's surface, but beneath public awareness, government agencies explored the darkest corners of human consciousness. Project MKUltra, officially sanctioned by the CIA in 1953 and active through 1973, sought to unlock the mind's potential through methods that would haunt participants for decades. This sprawling program encompassed 149 sub-projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies across North America. The goals ranged from developing truth serums and mind control techniques to exploring whether humans could develop psychic abilities through chemical and psychological manipulation. Hawkins National Laboratory, with its established infrastructure and Dr. Brenner's willingness to pursue research others found unconscionable, became one of MKUltra's most significant satellite facilities. The program's methodology reflected Cold War paranoia at its most extreme. Researchers administered LSD and other psychedelic substances to unwitting subjects, observing the results without informed consent. Sensory deprivation experiments pushed volunteers past psychological breaking points. Electroshock therapy was employed not to heal, but to erase memories or fracture personalities. Hypnosis techniques sought to create individuals who could be programmed to carry out actions without conscious awareness. The underlying philosophy held that the Soviet Union was pursuing similar research, and America could not afford to fall behind in this invisible arms race. Any method, no matter how ethically questionable, could be justified if it potentially provided strategic advantage. At Hawkins' lab, Brenner's participation in MKUltra allowed him to expand his research into consciousness beyond what local funding would have permitted. Adult subjects arrived through various channels, some genuinely volunteering for studies they believed were helping their country, others coerced through financial desperation or legal troubles that made refusal impossible. The experiments conducted in the basement levels progressed from uncomfortable to cruel as researchers discovered that extreme stress sometimes produced the psychic phenomena they sought. The sensory deprivation tanks became central to the work, with subjects spending hours or days floating in absolute darkness while their brain activity was monitored for unusual patterns. Terry Ives arrived at Hawkins' lab in the summer of 1969, responding to an advertisement seeking volunteers for psychological research. A college student at the time, passionate about activism and skeptical of government authority, she nevertheless needed money and found the promised compensation attractive. The recruitment materials mentioned nothing about drugs, nothing about the true nature of experiments, nothing about the risks she would face. Terry signed consent forms whose language obscured reality, trusting that university-affiliated research would maintain basic ethical standards. This trust would cost her everything, though she could not have known it as she entered the facility for her first session. The procedures Terry underwent began with standard psychological assessments designed to establish baseline measurements and identify any existing mental instabilities. She spent hours answering questions, completing tasks, allowing researchers to map her cognitive patterns. Then came the sensory deprivation tank sessions, her body floating in darkness while researchers observed from monitoring stations. Terry reported experiencing unusual sensations during these early sessions, a sense of expanding awareness, of touching thoughts that were not her own. These reports excited Brenner tremendously. Here was a subject whose consciousness could reach beyond normal boundaries without extensive conditioning. He began designing increasingly intense protocols specifically for her. The administration of psychoactive substances escalated Terry's capabilities while destabilizing her psychological equilibrium. LSD sessions in the tank produced experiences she struggled to articulate, visions of impossible landscapes, connections to presences that seemed vast and ancient. Brenner encouraged her to push further, to explore these altered states despite her growing fear. Other subjects in the program experienced similar phenomena with varying success. Some reported telepathic contacts or precognitive visions. Most simply endured confusion and temporary psychosis before recovering. A few suffered permanent breaks from reality, their minds unable to integrate what they had experienced during sessions. The researchers documented these outcomes clinically, adjusting protocols based on what worked and discarding subjects who proved too fragile for continued experimentation. Terry's pregnancy, discovered in early 1970, should have ended her participation immediately. Standard protocol, even in MKUltra's ethically compromised framework, prohibited experimenting on pregnant women due to unknown effects on fetal development. Brenner, however, saw opportunity rather than obstacle. His theory suggested that consciousness in its earliest developmental stages might prove more malleable, more capable of enhancement than adult minds already fixed in their patterns. He convinced Terry that the sessions would continue safely, that low doses and careful monitoring would protect both her and her unborn child. She trusted him, or perhaps felt she had no choice, having become dependent on the compensation that supported her through pregnancy. The sessions continued through her second and third trimesters, Terry's abilities seemingly growing stronger as her daughter developed. Jane Ives was born on a cold November morning in 1971, delivered not in a hospital, but in Hawkins Lab's medical facility. The birth was attended by staff who worked for Brenner rather than for Terry's welfare. Within hours of delivery, before Terry had fully regained consciousness from the anesthesia, her daughter was taken from her. When Terry woke and demanded her baby, she was told the child had died during delivery. No body was produced for burial. No death certificate was filed. Terry's protests were dismissed as grief-stricken delusions. When she persisted in claiming her daughter was alive, when she insisted on investigating the lab's lies, Brenner made a decision that would haunt multiple timelines. The electroshock therapy administered to Terry Ives was not therapeutic, but punitive and erasive. Repeated sessions of high-voltage currents surged through her brain, disrupting neural pathways and destroying the memories Brenner needed suppressed. The procedure left Terry in a permanent dissociative state, her consciousness trapped in an endless loop, reliving the moment her daughter was stolen. She could still breathe, still eat if fed, still move her eyes and respond to basic stimuli. But the person Terry Ives had been no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Her awareness had been shattered into fragments that could never reassemble into coherent selfhood. This fate, neither death nor life, represented the ultimate expression of what MKUltra enabled when researchers faced no consequences for their actions. Terry's sister Becky retrieved her from the lab when it became clear that further treatment would not be provided. She brought Terry home to the small house they had shared, caring for her sister's unresponsive body while trying to understand what had happened. Becky's attempts to investigate, to hold someone accountable, to find the infant niece she believed was alive somewhere, met walls of bureaucratic denial and legal immunity. The government invoked national security, documents were classified, witnesses refused to speak or claimed ignorance. Becky learned, as countless others had learned, that individuals had no recourse against agencies operating in shadows with official protection. She could only care for Terry, speaking to her constantly, though no response ever came, hoping that somewhere in the emptiness behind her sister's eyes, awareness persisted. Other MKUltra subjects at Hawkins Lab met various fates as the program progressed through the early 1970s. Some, having shown no useful abilities, were released with monetary settlements and threats ensuring silence. A few demonstrated genuine psychic phenomena, but proved too unstable or uncontrollable for Brenner's purposes. These individuals were institutionalized in facilities that specialized in containing people whose experiences had shattered them. The successful subjects, those who developed measurable abilities and could be manipulated through a combination of reward and fear, became the foundation for what would follow. Brenner's vision expanded beyond simply documenting psychic phenomena to actively cultivating it, preferably in subjects young enough to be shaped completely according to his specifications. By 1973, when MKUltra officially ended amid public scandal following Senate investigations, Hawkins' lab's most significant work had just begun. The program's termination changed nothing in the facility's operations. New funding streams were established under different classifications. The experiments continued without interruption, moving from adult subjects to the children, who would prove far more promising. Terry Ives's daughter, designated Subject 11, was growing up in laboratory confinement, her extraordinary abilities emerging under Brenner's careful cultivation. She knew nothing of the mother who sat frozen in perpetual trauma mere miles away. She knew nothing of the world beyond steel walls and controlled environments. Her childhood, stolen before it could truly begin, would shape not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone in Hawkins, and eventually, possibly the fate of the world itself. The experiments had not ended. They had merely gone deeper underground, focusing entirely on the children who had become numbered subjects in pursuit of impossible powers. The innocent lives sacrificed to this research would number in the dozens before the program finally imploded. The dimensional barrier that had held firm for millennia would be torn open by a child trying desperately to please the man she called Papa. And Hawkins, the ordinary town that harboured these secrets, would pay the price for hosting research that should never have been permitted. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, while Hawkins' children rode bicycles through suburban streets and attended school dances, other children lived in windowless rooms beneath their feet. These numbered subjects, designated by tattoos marking them as experimental materials rather than human beings, spent their developmental years training as psychic weapons in America's secret Cold War arsenal. The shift from adult to child subjects reflected Brenner's evolving theory that young minds, still forming neural pathways and not yet hardened into fixed patterns, could be shaped into instruments of unprecedented power. What began with Terry Ives's stolen infant expanded into a program that acquired children through various means, each more ethically indefensible than the last. The children arrived through channels that left no official trail. Some were born to program participants like Terry, seized immediately after delivery and declared deceased. Others came from desperate families offered money for children they could not support, told their sons or daughters would receive education and care in government custody. A few may have simply disappeared, taken from vulnerable situations where their absence would not generate investigation. The exact number of child subjects remained classified, but evidence suggested at least a dozen passed through Hawkins' Lab's program. Most acquired numerical designations corresponding to their entry order, though the system's logic was never fully revealed. 8, 10, 11, and others became their only names, their birth names erased along with any connection to their origins. The numbering system itself reflected the program's dehumanization. These children had no surnames, no birth certificates, no existence in any official database accessible to normal authorities. They were inventory, expensive and carefully maintained inventory, but inventory nonetheless. The tattoos marked them permanently, ensuring that if they somehow escaped, they could be identified and retrieved. This mark, burned into flesh usually on the inner wrist or forearm, became as much a part of their identity as their demonstrated abilities. They were numbers before they were people, test subjects before they were children, tools being forged for purposes they could not understand. Life within Hawkins' Lab's containment areas followed rigid schedules designed to maximize ability development while minimizing individual identity formation. The children woke at designated times, dressed in identical clothing, ate meals together under supervision, and moved between testing rooms according to protocols that varied based on their demonstrated powers. Dr. Brenner maintained personal oversight of the program, involving himself in each child's training with an attention that mimicked paternal care while serving purely instrumental purposes. He encouraged the subjects to call him Papa, creating an artificial family structure that bound them psychologically to their captor while isolating them from any competing emotional attachments. The early years of a subject's life focused on identifying and categorizing their specific abilities. Some children demonstrated telekinetic capabilities, able to move objects through mental concentration alone. Others showed aptitude for remote viewing, their consciousness able to project beyond their physical location to observe distant places. Empathic abilities appeared in a few, manifesting as capacity to sense and sometimes manipulate others' emotional states. Each power emerged gradually, triggered by the tank sessions and psychological pressure techniques that constituted their primary training methodology. Brenner's staff documented every manifestation meticulously, adjusting protocols to enhance promising abilities while attempting to suppress undesirable traits like compassion or independence. 8, later known as Carly, possessed abilities that particularly fascinated the researchers. Her power manifested as reality manipulation, the capacity to create illusions indistinguishable from physical reality in the minds of those she targeted. This gift, potentially more valuable than raw telekinetic force, made her a favorite subject for intensive training. Carly's sessions pushed her to create increasingly complex and disturbing visions, testing the limits of how thoroughly she could deceive human perception. The psychological cost of this training showed in her growing anger and resentment, emotions that would eventually fuel her escape, but also warp her understanding of how to use her abilities. Her disappearance from the lab sometime in the late 1970s represented both a failure of security and an alarming demonstration that subjects might develop agency despite all conditioning. Subject 11, the daughter Terry Ives never raised, demonstrated abilities that exceeded all other subjects combined. Jane, though she would not reclaim this name for years, could move objects with her mind, project her consciousness across vast distances, access memories and thoughts of others, and most remarkably, contact entities existing beyond normal dimensional boundaries. These capabilities emerged gradually through her early childhood, manifesting first as small disruptions and growing stronger as her training intensified. By age 7, she could lift objects weighing several pounds. By 9, she could shatter reinforced glass through mental force alone. Her power continued scaling upward in ways that both thrilled and frightened Brenner, suggesting potential applications far beyond anything previously imagined. The relationships between subjects remained carefully controlled but could not be entirely prevented. Children housed in proximity, suffering similar experiences, naturally formed connections despite regulations against communication. These bonds, formed in silence and secret gestures, provided the subjects with their only experience of genuine human relationship. 8 and 11 developed particular closeness before Carly's escape. The older girl attempting to protect and guide the younger one through the program's harshest elements. When 8 vanished, 11 felt the loss profoundly, her first experience of grief for someone she had known and cared about. This capacity for attachment, never fully suppressed despite all Brenner's conditioning, would later prove crucial to her eventual escape and integration into normal society. The facility where the children lived consisted of sterile white corridors and controlled environments designed to eliminate external stimuli that might interfere with training. Individual cells provided sleeping quarters, each furnished with only a bed and basic necessities. The Rainbow Room, so named for the colourful mats and toys that gave it a superficial resemblance to a nursery, served as the primary space where subjects gathered under supervision. Here they played with puzzles and games designed to enhance cognitive function, while researchers observed for signs of ability manifestation. The room's cheerful appearance contrasted grotesquely with its actual function as an observation chamber where children were studied like laboratory animals. Punishment for disobedience ranged from isolation to more severe methods designed to ensure compliance without damaging the subjects physically. Children who refused to perform in sessions were locked in their cells without food or social contact. Those who showed defiance or attempted to use their abilities against staff were sedated and subjected to psychological reconditioning. The worst punishment, rarely employed but always threatened, involved the quiet room, a sensory deprivation chamber where children could be left for hours or days, their developing minds vulnerable to the dissolution of self that darkness and isolation produced. The threat of this punishment ensured most subjects cooperated with even the most demanding protocols. Not all children survived the program. Some proved psychologically too fragile, their minds fracturing under the pressure of training that pushed past human tolerance. Others demonstrated abilities that proved uncontrollable, dangerous to themselves or surrounding staff, requiring termination of their participation in permanent fashion. These failures were documented and analysed for insights into what produced successful versus unsuccessful outcomes. The bodies were disposed of through channels that ensured no questions would be asked. Brenner viewed these losses as unfortunate but acceptable costs of the research, necessary sacrifices on the path to creating controllable psychic weapons for government deployment. The 1979 incident that would later be understood as involving a far more dangerous entity than anyone suspected occurred on an ordinary afternoon when 11 was 8 years old. The details remained classified and confused even within lab records, but the outcome was undeniable. Multiple subjects died violently. Staff were killed in ways that suggested powerful telekinetic force applied with lethal intent. Blood-marked walls and floors throughout entire sections of the facility. The investigation concluded that one of the subjects had experienced catastrophic loss of control, killing indiscriminately before somehow escaping or dying in a manner that left no body. The truth that something far more malevolent had been responsible would not emerge for years. In the aftermath, Hawkins Lab's child subject program continued with even more stringent security measures. 11, who had survived the massacre through circumstances she could not fully remember, became Brenner's sole focus. Her abilities, already strong, seemed to have strengthened in the incident's wake. He dedicated himself completely to cultivating her power, pushing her harder than he had pushed any previous subject. The tank sessions increased in frequency and duration. The demands on her to reach further, to contact entities beyond normal perception, grew more insistent. Brenner's obsession with 11 specifically would later prove to have catastrophic consequences when he finally pushed her to make contact with something that should never have been disturbed. By November 1983, 11 had lived 12 years knowing nothing beyond laboratory walls. She had never attended school, never played with friends, never experienced the ordinary childhood visible through the facility's few windows. Her entire existence centered on expanding her abilities and pleasing Papa. Though some part of her recognized the wrongness of her situation, even if she lacked vocabulary to name it, the tank had become her second home, the darkness where her mind traveled while her body floated in salt water. Yet beneath the training and trauma, something fundamental remained. Her capacity for connection, for loyalty, for love, had not been destroyed despite every attempt to make her purely instrumental. When opportunity for escape finally arrived, these suppressed qualities would guide her toward the friends who would change everything, the boys who would show her that family could mean something besides the twisted relationship Brenner had imposed. November 6, 1983 began as an ordinary Wednesday in Hawkins, Indiana. Students attended classes at Hawkins middle and high schools, navigating the social hierarchies and academic demands that defined adolescent life. Workers clocked into shifts at local businesses, and the still mysterious lab on the town's edge. Families prepared dinner in kitchens, where the most pressing concerns involved homework completion and television schedules. The autumn air carried the crispness of approaching winter, leaves crunching underfoot as children played outdoors during the remaining daylight hours. Nothing about the day suggested that by midnight a child would vanish into impossible darkness, a laboratory would lose its most valuable subject, and a small group of friends would begin a journey that would test bonds forged in basements over fantasy games. The experiment conducted that evening in Hawkins' lab's deepest chamber followed protocols Brenner had refined through years of pushing Eleven's abilities to their limits. She floated in the sensory deprivation tank, her consciousness extending beyond her body into spaces that existed outside normal perception. The researchers monitored her brain activity from observation stations, noting patterns that suggested successful contact with distant locations or entities. Brenner urged her to reach further, to explore regions her mind had touched in previous sessions but never fully accessed. 11, desperate to please Papa and prove her worth, pushed past the boundaries of what felt safe. Her awareness stretched into darkness, absolute, into a realm where something waited with patient hunger. The creature 11 encountered existed in a dimension the researchers had theorized, but never proven. The Demogorgon, as it would later be named by boys who understood monsters through fantasy games rather than government classifications, was a predator from the upside down. When 11's psychic presence touched it, the entity responded with immediate interest. The contact created a bridge between dimensions, a connection that should never have existed. 11 screamed, her physical body convulsing in the tank as her mind recoiled from what she had touched. The Demogorgon pushed back against her awareness, seeking the source of contact, hunting instinctively for the gateway that had suddenly appeared. The gate tore open in the laboratory's sub-basement, a wound in reality itself that defied every law of physics the researchers thought they understood. The barrier between worlds, which had held firm through countless ages, ruptured under the pressure of psychic contact combined with the creature's response. The opening appeared as a membrane-like surface, organic and wrong, pulsing with energy that registered on instruments never designed to measure such phenomena. Alarms blared throughout the facility, emergency protocols activated. Staff scrambled to understand what had occurred while the Demogorgon, now possessing a physical pathway between dimensions, prepared to cross into a world filled with prey. In the chaos that followed the gate's opening, 11 fled. The guards who normally controlled her movements had rushed to address the emergency in the lower levels. The locked doors that usually confined her stood open as personnel evacuated endangered areas. She ran through corridors she had only glimpsed during supervised movements between her cell and testing chambers, her thin hospital gown and shaved head marking her as something that did not belong in any normal context. The November night air hit her as she escaped through a ground-level exit, cold and overwhelming after years of climate-controlled confinement. She ran toward the forest surrounding the lab, putting distance between herself and the only home she had ever known, driven by terror and opportunity combined. That same evening, 4 boys gathered in Mike Wheeler's basement for their regular Friday night Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Mike, Lucas, Dustin, and Will had maintained this tradition for years. Their friendship built on shared imagination and the safe adventures that dice and storytelling provided. The campaign that night, masterfully orchestrated by Mike, reached a climactic moment where Will's character faced a powerful enemy. His role would determine the outcome. The dice tumbled. The result proved unfavourable. The Demogorgon in their game claimed victory, and the session ended with laughter and protests about fair play. None of them could have known how prescient their choice of monster had been, that a real Demogorgon had entered their world mere miles away. Will's bicycle ride home followed the familiar route through Mirkwood, the forest path the boys had named after Tolkien's dark woods. The November darkness pressed close around the road, broken only by his bike's inadequate headlight. Will pedalled steadily, comfortable in surroundings he had navigated hundreds of times. When his light began flickering, he assumed mechanical failure rather than proximity to something that disrupted electrical systems. The Demogorgon appeared suddenly, blocking his path, a creature whose physical form defied description, even as it burned itself into Will's terrified memory. He turned and fled, abandoning his bicycle, running desperately toward his house, while the predator pursued through shadows. Will reached the buyer's home and burst inside, his panicked calls for his mother echoing through the empty house. Joyce was working her evening shift at the general store. Jonathan, his older brother, had plans with friends. Will was alone when the Demogorgon cornered him. The creature, operating on hunting instincts rather than malice, simply recognized prey and acted accordingly. Will's disappearance occurred in seconds, the monster dragging him through a temporary portal into the Upside Down. The house returned to stillness. Will's desperate calls faded into silence. When Joyce arrived home later that night, she found nothing unusual except her son's absence and a growing dread she could not rationally explain. The following morning brought different responses to Will's disappearance from those who loved him. Joyce Byers, a single mother whose life had been defined by financial struggle and devotion to her sons, felt immediately that something more than a runaway situation had occurred. Her calls to Jonathan, to Will's friends, to anyone who might know his whereabouts, grew increasingly frantic as hours passed without word. The missing person report filed at Hawkins Police Department followed standard protocols for child disappearances, but Joyce's insistence that Will would never simply leave home planted seeds of concern in Chief Jim Hopper's mind. He had known Joyce for years, understood her as dramatic perhaps, but not delusional. Her fear convinced him that this case required serious investigation rather than waiting for a boy to return home on his own. The boys learned of Will's disappearance when they woke Saturday morning to phone calls and parental questions about whether they had seen their friend. Mike, Dustin, and Lucas converged quickly, cycling to the area where Will's abandoned bicycle had been found near Mirkwood. Their investigation, conducted with the seriousness that only 12-year-old boys could bring to such a mission, revealed no clues that would satisfy adult authorities. However, their search that evening produced a discovery that would change everything. The girl they found hiding in the woods, soaked from rain and terrified of sounds and movements, wore a hospital gown and had a shaved head that suggested medical treatment. When she would only speak her number rather than a name, when she demonstrated that she understood their questions but lacked vocabulary to explain herself, Mike made a decision that reflected both compassion and the adventure-seeking nature of a boy raised on stories of hidden friends and secret rescues. Eleven's arrival in Mike's basement marked the beginning of her introduction to a world she had only glimpsed through windows and television screens during her confinement. The boys, sworn to secrecy by Mike's insistence, provided her with clothing, blankets, and the first genuine kindness she had experienced from people who wanted nothing from her except friendship. Her communication remained limited to single words and gestures, her education having focused entirely on ability development rather than normal childhood learning. When she demonstrated her powers by slamming Mike's bedroom door shut with mental force alone, the boy's fear transformed into wonder. She was not just a girl in trouble, she was something impossible made real, evidence that the fantasy worlds they explored through games reflected truths about reality's hidden nature. Joyce Byers' descent into what others perceived as grief-driven madness began with the lights. The electrical disturbances in her home defied normal explanation, bulbs flashing in patterns that seemed responsive rather than random. When she called out to Will in her desperation, the lights flashed in answer. This communication, impossible yet undeniable, convinced Joyce that her son remained alive somewhere, trapped but able to reach out through electrical current. She purchased Christmas lights in bulk, stringing them throughout her living room and assigning each bulb a letter of the alphabet. The makeshift Ouija board that resulted allowed Will to spell out messages one letter at a time, his consciousness touching the electrical system from whatever impossible place he inhabited. The message Will spelled through the lights demonstrated both his survival and his desperate situation. "Right here," he communicated when Joyce asked his location, a response that made no sense yet conveyed essential truth. He was right there, in the house with her, but displaced into a dimension she could not perceive. The upside down where the Demogorgon had taken him existed alongside their world, occupying the same physical space but separated by dimensional barriers. Will hid in this nightmare version of his home, in the fort he had built in the backyard during happier times, evading the monster that hunted him while trying desperately to signal his mother that he remained alive. Hopper's investigation proceeded along more conventional lines, though his instincts told him that Will's disappearance involved factors beyond typical runaway or abduction scenarios. His examination of the area around Will's abandoned bicycle revealed details that troubled him, marks in the earth that suggested something large had been present, disruption of surrounding vegetation that indicated struggle or pursuit. When state police dragged the quarry and recovered a body purported to be Will Byers, Joyce's absolute refusal to accept this identification, despite official confirmation, convinced Hopper that something deeply wrong was occurring. His decision to investigate Hawkins' lab, to push past the Department of Energy's stonewalling and security, put him on a collision course with forces far more powerful than a small-town police chief normally encountered. The boys' efforts to hide and protect Eleven created complications that tested their friendship. Lucas, practical and suspicious by nature, questioned whether harboring a strange girl with unexplained powers was wise or safe. Dustin attempted mediation, recognizing both Lucas's reasonable concerns and Mike's conviction that Eleven needed their help. Mike himself had formed a bond with Elle that transcended rational explanation, his protective instincts engaged by her vulnerability and his wonder sustained by her abilities. When Elle demonstrated that she could locate Will using the Dungeons and Dragons board as a map, projecting her consciousness to find him in the dimension where he hid, the boys understood that their fantasy games had prepared them for the impossible situation they now faced. Barbara Holland's disappearance the same week went largely unnoticed beyond her best friend, Nancy Wheeler's, immediate circle. Barb had accompanied Nancy to a party at Steve Harrington's house, disappearing from the poolside while Nancy was inside with Steve. The creature that took Barb operated with the same hunting efficiency it had shown with Will, recognizing isolated prey and acting swiftly. Barb's fate, unlike Will's, would not involve prolonged survival. The Upside Down claimed her quickly, her body left to decay in the toxic atmosphere, while her death went uninvestigated by authorities focused on the more visible case of the missing Byers boy. Nancy's growing awareness that something terrible had happened to her friend drove her own investigation, one that converged unexpectedly with Jonathan Byers' search for his brother. Jonathan's photographs, taken in the woods while looking for signs of Will, accidentally captured images at the moment of Barb's abduction. The blurred figure barely visible in the frame suggested something large and predatory, something that did not belong in any known biological classification. When Nancy and Jonathan compared their evidence and experiences, when they discovered the wounded deer whose blood trail led to a tree containing an organic portal into another dimension, they found themselves drawn into the same impossible situation the boys faced, armed with determination, but lacking any framework for understanding what they confronted. The Upside Down into which Nancy was pulled through the tree's portal revealed a world that defied rational comprehension. The landscape mirrored Hawkins in structure, but presented everything in decay and wrongness. The air tasted foul, thick with particles that floated like toxic snow. The vegetation grew twisted and lifeless, covered in vines that pulsed with disturbing regularity. Most terrifying was the creature that inhabited this realm, the Demogorgon hunting through familiar locations rendered nightmarish. Nancy's encounter with the predator, her desperate flight back toward the portal, and Jonathan's frantic efforts to pull her through demonstrated that the barrier between dimensions, while torn open at the lab, could form temporary weaknesses elsewhere, particularly where trauma or violence had occurred. Hopper's breakthrough in understanding the scope of what faced Hawkins came when he and Joyce broke into the county morgue to examine the body, supposedly belonging to Will. Their discovery that the corpse was artificial, a doll created to deceive, confirmed that governmental forces were engaged in active cover-up. The subsequent drugging and threats they experienced from lab agents convinced Hopper that conventional investigation would prove insufficient. His decision to make a deal, trading information about Eleven's whereabouts for access to the Upside Down to search for Will, represented a compromise between his duty to find a missing child and the impossibility of fighting Hawkins' lab directly. The moral ambiguity of betraying the boy's hiding place to save Will would haunt him, though he justified the choice as necessary. The boys' discovery of Eleven's true origins and connection to the lab came through their investigation into the mysterious adult men searching the town for a missing child. When Elle revealed her number tattoo, when she explained through limited vocabulary that the bad men wanted to take her back, the boys understood that their friend was not just unusual, but actively hunted. Lucas's anger at the danger Elle had brought into their lives, his accusation that she had known about Will's fate but not shared this knowledge immediately, created a rift in the group that required Elle's demonstration of genuine remorse and friendship to heal. Her willingness to use her powers to help find Will, despite the personal cost, proved to Lucas that her loyalty was real. The convergence at Hawkins Middle School brought all storylines together in confrontation that tested everyone's courage and revealed the extent of Elle's abilities. Brenner's arrival with armed agents cornered the boys in the school building, leaving them apparently without escape. Eleven's choice in this moment demonstrated how thoroughly she'd broken from the conditioning that defined her laboratory existence. Rather than surrender to Papa's demands, she attacked the agents directly, using telekinetic force to kill multiple men who had served as her jailers and tormentors. The violence she employed shocked the boys even as it saved their lives. This display of lethal power drained Elle physically and emotionally, leaving her weakened at the moment when her abilities would be most desperately needed. Hopper and Joyce's journey into the Upside Down through the gate in Hawkins' lab required hazmat suits and equipment that barely protected them from the dimension's toxic atmosphere. Their navigation through the nightmare landscape, following the Christmas lights Joyce had strung in her home, as beacons that somehow projected across dimensions, led them to the Byers house, as it existed in that realm. Finding Will's fort, discovering the boy barely alive and unresponsive after days of breathing poisoned air and evading the Demogorgon's hunts, brought relief mixed with terror that they might lose him during extraction. The CPR Hopper performed after pulling Will back through the gate, the desperate compressions that finally brought breath back into the child's lungs, saved a life that had been sustained through determination and the communication Will had maintained with his mother across impossible distance. The Demogorgon's appearance at the school transformed rescue operation into life-or-death battle. The creature, perhaps drawn by the concentration of prey or by Elle's psychic signature, emerged from a wall that dissolved into organic portal. 11 faced the monster that her psychic contact had allowed into Hawkins, the predator whose presence had destroyed Will's life and taken Barb's. Her decision to confront it directly, to use every remaining ounce of her power despite her depleted state, represented both self-sacrifice and acceptance of responsibility. The confrontation itself occurred in moments. Elle's consciousness and the Demogorgon's physical form seeming to annihilate each other in a burst of energy that left no trace of either. The immediate aftermath of that November week saw Will Byers hospitalized, recovering from exposure to toxic atmosphere and trauma that doctors struggled to treat without understanding its true source. Elle's disappearance left Mike devastated, the boys uncertain whether she had died or simply been displaced elsewhere. Hopper's knowledge that she had vanished rather than died led him to begin leaving food in the forest, a ritual of hope maintained in secret. The town of Hawkins, told that a chemical leak from the lab had caused strange phenomena and tragically claimed Barbara Holland, accepted the explanation with the relief of people who preferred comfortable lies to impossible truths. Families returned to normal routines. The holiday season approached with its promise of celebration and renewal. December brought cautious celebrations for those who understood what had truly occurred. Will's recovery, though complicated by psychological trauma and physical effects that doctors monitored carefully, allowed him to return home to Joyce's tearful care. The boys reunited in Mike's basement, their campaigns feeling different now that they had faced real monsters and learned that courage meant acting despite fear rather than lacking it. The annual snowball dance approached, offering the middle school students a return to normal adolescent concerns about romance and social status. Life resumed patterns that would have been recognizable to any observer who had not witnessed the previous week's impossibilities. Yet signs of the Upside Down's lingering influence appeared in Will's bathroom when he coughed a slug-like creature into the sink, evidence that his time in that dimension had not left him entirely unchanged. The gate beneath Hawkins' lab, supposedly sealed through Elle's sacrifice, had left a scar in reality that could not be fully healed by the government's attempts to contain and conceal. The town had survived its first encounter with the dimension that existed alongside their world, but the connection between realms, once established, proved resistant to permanent severance. The children who had fought and won would need to remain vigilant, their ordinary lives now shadowed by knowledge that darkness existed just beyond perception's edge, patient and hungry, waiting for opportunity to return. October 1984 arrived with autumn colours and Halloween preparations. Nearly a year after Will Byers' rescue from the Upside Down, the boys had grown taller, their voices beginning to crack at unpredictable moments, their interests expanding beyond fantasy games to include the arcade's electronic competitions. Mike missed Elle constantly, his attempts to contact her through radio equipment yielding only static and frustration. Will struggled with memories and episodes he could not fully explain to those who loved him, but had not experienced what he had endured. Hawkins appeared recovered from the previous year's strange events, the town's collective memory already softening trauma into manageable narrative. Yet beneath the fields and streets, tunnels were spreading like infected veins, and something vast and malevolent had fixed its attention on the boy who had survived its realm. The party's dynamics shifted with the arrival of Max Mayfield, a girl from California whose skateboarding skills and arcade mastery immediately caught attention. Her integration into the group created tensions that reflected both typical adolescent social awkwardness and the specific complications of a friend circle defined by shared supernatural trauma. Lucas and Dustin both developed immediate interest in Max, competing for her attention with efforts that ranged from charming to embarrassing. Mike, however, resisted her inclusion entirely, his loyalty to Elle preventing him from accepting any replacement in their group. This resistance, while understandable given his grief over Elle's disappearance, created friction that required Max's patience and determination to overcome gradually. Billy Hargrove's arrival, alongside his stepsister, brought a different kind of disruption to Hawkins High School. His California origins, combined with physical attractiveness and calculated charm, deployed selectively, made him immediately popular among certain crowds. Beneath this appealing surface, however, lay anger and cruelty that manifested in his treatment of Max, whom he controlled through intimidation and violence learned from their shared household. Billy's rage, rooted in abuse he himself suffered, would later make him vulnerable to possession by forces seeking human vessels. His complicated nature, simultaneously victim and perpetrator, embodied the difficulty of assigning simple moral categories to people shaped by trauma. Will's episodes began as brief moments of disconnection, flashes where his awareness seemed to slip sideways into another space. He would freeze mid-sentence, his eyes unfocused, his consciousness touching something that pulled at him from beyond normal perception. These incidents increased in frequency and duration through October, each one leaving Will more exhausted and frightened. Joyce recognized immediately that something was wrong, her maternal instincts honed by the previous year's nightmare, alerting her to signs others might dismiss as ordinary stress. Her insistence on medical evaluation brought Will into contact with Dr. Sam Owens, the scientist who had replaced Brenner as Hawkins Lab's director following the previous year's catastrophic security failures. Owens represented a different approach to the dimensional breach than his predecessor had embodied. Where Brenner pursued power and control without regard for human cost, Owens focused on containment and mitigation, attempting to clean up the disaster he had inherited while preventing further incursions from the upside down. His treatment of Will reflected genuine concern for the boy's welfare rather than purely scientific interest. The tests and monitoring he prescribed sought to understand Will's ongoing connection to the parallel dimension without exploiting that connection for strategic advantage. This more ethical stance, while appreciated by Joyce, could not prevent what was already happening to her son. The shadow creature Will glimpsed during his episodes towered impossibly tall, a storm given form and malevolent purpose. The Mind Flayer, as Dustin would name it after consulting his Dungeons and Dragons manual, existed as something beyond individual entity, a hive consciousness that commanded all creatures within the Upside Down. Its attention fixed on Will specifically resulted from his extended time in its realm the previous year. The boy had survived in the Mind Flayer's domain longer than any human should have, creating a connection that persisted after his rescue. Now this vast intelligence sought to expand that connection, to use Will as a bridge for invasion rather than simply claiming him as prey. Dustin's discovery upon returning from science camp brought complications of a different nature, but equal concern. The creature he found in his trash can, initially small and apparently harmless, grew with alarming speed and developed characteristics that suggested upside-down origins. Dart, as Dustin named his supposed pet, molted and changed, revealing itself as an adolescent demogorgon rather than the harmless species Dustin had convinced himself existed. His attachment to the creature, combined with reluctance to admit his mistake in hiding it, delayed warnings to his friends until Dart had grown large enough to pose genuine danger. This pattern of affection preceding recognition of threat would recur throughout the coming crisis. The tunnel spreading beneath Hawkins represented the Mind Flayer's physical preparation for invasion. These organic passages, lined with vines that pulsed with coordinated rhythm, extended from the gate at the lab throughout the town's subterranean spaces. They formed a network that mirrored Hawkins's street layout while existing below it, a hidden infrastructure through which the Upside Down's influence could spread. The discovery of these tunnels began with pumpkin rot, crops dying in spreading circles that suggested contamination from below. When Hopper investigated a farmer's complaint and found himself descending into passages that should not exist, he recognized immediately that the previous year's threat had not ended, but merely changed tactical approach. Elle's life with Hopper in his isolated cabin provided safety, but also profound frustration. The chief's insistence on complete concealment made sense given that Hawkins' lab and other government agencies continued searching for their escaped subject. However, for a girl who had spent her entire conscious life in confinement, this new cage, however well-intentioned, chafed unbearably. Hopper's rules restricted not just her movements, but her connections, forbidding contact with Mike, despite her desperate desire to reach the boy who had shown her friendship and protection. The father-daughter dynamic developing between them carried love, but also tension, each learning to navigate a relationship neither had experienced before. The cabin's isolation left Elle dependent entirely on Hopper for human contact and information about the outside world. Television became her primary window into normal life, the soap operas and sitcoms teaching her about relationships, emotions, and social interactions she had never observed firsthand. Her attempts to master the vocabulary and behavioral patterns these shows presented resulted in stilted imitations that reflected her incomplete socialization. When Hopper's patrol schedule prevented him from returning for dinner, her anger manifested in ways that demonstrated how thoroughly her powers remained connected to emotional state. The cabin's demolished interior following one such episode convinced Hopper that her isolation could not continue indefinitely without psychological cost. Bob Newby's relationship with Joyce Byers introduced gentle normalcy into a household haunted by impossible trauma. Bob, who managed Radio Shack and had known Joyce since their high school years, approached her sons with genuine kindness, rather than attempting to replace their absent father. His technological knowledge proved unexpectedly valuable when Will's drawings of the tunnels he glimpsed during episodes accumulated into a pattern Bob recognized as a map. The suggestion to view the drawings as puzzle pieces rather than isolated images allowed Hopper to navigate the underground passages and understand their extent. Bob's unassuming heroism, rooted in simply helping without fully comprehending what he faced, would later cost him everything. Will's full possession by the Mind Flayer occurred gradually, and then suddenly, his consciousness pushed aside by an alien intelligence that claimed his body as its own. The transformation happened during one of his episodes, the shadow creature he had glimpsed so often finally closing the distance between them. When Will returned to awareness, or appeared to, something else looked through his eyes, something that analysed its surroundings with predatory calculation. The possessed boy reported his episodes had ceased, claiming relief that worried Joyce more than the episodes themselves had. Her maternal instinct recognised that her son's responses felt wrong, his affect flattened, his reactions slightly delayed as if he were translating from an internal language she could not access. Joyce's recognition that Will was being used as a spy forced terrible choices about how to proceed. The Mind Flayer, operating through Will's awareness, learned everything the boy observed about defensive preparations and the tunnel system's mapping. Hopper's discovery in the tunnels, where he was overcome by spore clouds that knocked him unconscious, demonstrated the hive's defensive capabilities. His radio calls for help, weakening as his oxygen-deprived brain began shutting down, reached Will, and through Will reached the Mind Flayer, which ensured no rescue would arrive. Only Bob's ability to interpret Will's drawings as map allowed Joyce and Mike to locate Hopper before he suffocated in darkness. The decision to separate Will from the Mind Flayer's influence required methods that approached the brutal while remaining necessary. Joyce understood that the cold was key, that the entity possessing her son originated from a frozen dimension and might be vulnerable to heat. The gathering at Hopper's cabin, where Will was bound to a chair and the temperature raised to levels approaching dangerous for human physiology, tested everyone's resolve. Will's screams as the heat drove the Mind Flayer from his body came in his voice, but expressed the entity's rage and pain. The exorcism, for that was what the procedure truly was, succeeded in expelling the possession, but left Will exhausted and traumatized by the memory of hosting an alien consciousness that had used him against everyone he loved. Elle's journey to Chicago to find Kaylee represented her first independent action since escaping the lab nearly a year earlier. The discovery of her mother's file in Hopper's cabin, revealing Terry Ives's existence and address, had planted seeds of yearning for connection to her origins. When Elle finally broke Hopper's rules and travelled to visit the woman who had birthed her, she found a person trapped in mental loops, endlessly reliving trauma. Terry's sister, Becky, provided information about another child from the lab's program, the girl with number 8 tattooed on her wrist. This lead gave Elle a different kind of family to seek, someone who might understand what she had experienced in ways no one else could. Carly's path since escaping Hawkins' lab had led her to vengeance, using her illusion powers to hunt and kill the men who had participated in their childhood torture. Elle's reunion with 8 in a Chicago warehouse introduced her to found family built on shared trauma and directed anger. Kaylee's group welcomed Elle, recognizing her power and seeing potential for expanding their revenge campaign. The invitation to join permanently, to embrace rage and use her abilities for payback against everyone who had harmed them, tempted Elle with the promise of belonging and purpose. Kaylee pushed Elle to access her anger, to channel memories of pain and loss into fuel for her powers, teaching lessons about emotional access that would prove valuable even as Elle ultimately rejected the path of pure vengeance. Elle's choice to return to Hawkins, rather than remain with Carly, reflected her growth beyond the binary options Brenner had offered in the lab. She could embrace neither pure compliance nor pure revenge, but instead chose the more difficult path of protecting those who had shown her love, despite its complications and costs. The decision crystallized when she accessed her powers to find Mike and Hopper in the void, observing them in danger, seeing through her remote viewing that her friends needed help only she could provide. This recognition of obligation to those who cared for her, combined with her own love for them, pulled her back toward Hawkins, despite unresolved questions about her mother and her own identity. The demo dog's attack on Hawkins' lab occurred as scientists and military personnel attempted to implement controlled burns of the tunnel system. These creatures, adolescent demogorgons operating under mind flayer coordination, swarmed through the facility with horrifying efficiency. The lockdown protocols that sealed sections to contain the breach also trapped personnel inside with the predators. Bob's sacrifice saving Joyce and the boys demonstrated courage rooted in love rather than physical prowess or special training. His manipulation of computer systems to reopen locked doors, his navigation through the building while demo dogs hunted him, his final sprint towards safety that ended meters short of escape, marked the death of an ordinary man performing extraordinary actions so that others might live. Steve Harrington's evolution from popular athlete focused on social status to protector of children facing supernatural threats continued during this crisis. His assumption of responsibility for keeping Dustin, Lucas, Max, and the temporarily possessed Will safe, while adults dealt with larger strategic concerns, demonstrated maturity his previous self would not have possessed. The bond forming between Steve and Dustin specifically, based on mutual respect and surprising compatibility, despite age and social status differences, provided both with a relationship neither had known they needed. Steve's willingness to fight demo dogs, armed with his signature nail-studded bat, showed that heroism could emerge from unexpected sources when circumstances demanded it. Elle's arrival at the lab, her powers fully accessed, and her determination absolute, saved everyone trapped by the demo dog swarm. Her battle clearing a path through the creatures showcased abilities developed far beyond what Brenner had managed to cultivate. The emotional reunion with Mike after nearly a year of separation, their embrace communicating more than words could express, anchored Elle in her choice to return. She had found family in Carly's group, had discovered the possibility of a different kind of belonging, but ultimately recognized that family meant those who had proven through actions their commitment to her welfare and happiness, regardless of her usefulness. The plan to close the gate permanently required Elle to descend into the chamber where the dimensional breach had first opened, to use her powers in sustained effort that would test her limits. While she and Hopper prepared for this attempt, the others worked to distract the Mind Flayer by severing Will's connection to the hive consciousness. The revelation that harming the tunnels harmed the entity controlling them suggested that a coordinated attack might divide the Mind Flayer's attention sufficiently for Elle to complete her work. Steve, tasked with keeping the kids safe at the Byers' house, found his charges unwilling to remain passive when they could contribute to distracting the entity that had possessed their friend. Elle's effort to seal the gate consumed everything she possessed. The psychic force required to push the dimensional breach closed, to knit reality back together after it had been torn open, demanded sustained concentration and power beyond anything she had previously attempted. The chamber shook as her consciousness pressed against the Upside Down's intrusion into their world. Blood streamed from her nose, her body beginning to shut down under the strain. Hopper's encouragement, his absolute faith that she could accomplish what seemed impossible, provided emotional anchor, keeping her focused despite agony and exhaustion. The gate contracted slowly, fighting her efforts, the Mind Flayer on the other side, pushing back with all its vast presence. The moment of closure brought both relief and recognition that victory was incomplete. The gate sealed, pushed closed by Elle's will made manifest. But the entity beyond remained aware of Hawkins, aware of the connection that had existed, patient in its determination to try again. The Mind Flayer's retreat into the Upside Down represented tactical withdrawal rather than defeat. It had learned about humanity through Will's consciousness. It had tested defenses and identified vulnerabilities. The closing of this particular gateway would not end its interest in a dimension filled with billions of potential hosts for its hive consciousness. December brought the snowball dance, the middle school's annual tradition, allowing students to dress up and practice social skills in a controlled environment. Girls wore their best dresses, having spent hours selecting outfits and practicing hair and makeup. Boys applied cologne with adolescent excess, hoping to impress crushes while pretending indifference to the entire affair. Dustin's hair, styled with spray to achieve impressive height, represented hours of preparation designed to catch Max's attention. Lucas and Max, having navigated the complications of their developing relationship through the crisis just ended, shared awkward first dances that marked beginnings of understanding each other as more than fellow monster fighters. Will found himself genuinely smiling, free from the shadow's presence for the first time in months, able to enjoy a normal evening without episodes or possession. When Elle arrived wearing the dress Hopper had given her and the makeup she had carefully applied following magazine instructions, Mike forgot every other person in the gymnasium. Their slow dance marked not just romantic beginning, but the end of months of separation and fear. Her powers, still present but dormant, no longer defined her entire existence. She was simply a girl, at a dance with a boy who had proven, through actions, that his loyalty transcended convenience. The evening provided respite, a few hours of adolescent normalcy for children who had faced adult horrors and survived through courage and friendship. These moments of peace, however temporary, mattered precisely because everyone present understood how fragile such peace could be. Yet through the school's windows, had anyone looked skyward with awareness of what to observe, they might have glimpsed storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Within those clouds, something vast and patient watched the town that had twice escaped its grasp, learning, planning, preparing for the day when barriers between dimensions would fail again and allow it to claim what it had been denied. Summer 1985 arrived in Hawkins with swimming pools, fireworks preparations, and the grand opening of Starcourt Mall, the retail palace that promised to transform the town's economy and social life. Families flocked to air-conditioned stores, offering products previously available only through catalogues or trips to Indianapolis. Teenagers found employment and gathering places where they could escape parental supervision, while technically remaining within acceptable boundaries. The mall's gleaming floors and neon lights created an environment that felt futuristic, a sharp contrast to the small-town atmosphere Hawkins had maintained for over a century. Beneath this commercial optimism, however, Russian scientists worked in absolute secrecy, determined to accomplish what American researchers had failed to maintain after closing the gate months earlier. The economic impact of Starcourt's arrival extended beyond the jobs it created for Hawkins' youth. Downtown businesses, family-owned stores that had served the community for generations, suffered immediate decline as customers discovered the variety and convenience the mall offered. The hardware store where Joyce had worked saw foot traffic diminish to a trickle. The local pharmacy lost prescriptions to the mall's chain alternative. This shift from community-centered commerce to corporate retail changed not just where people shopped, but how they interacted, replacing personal relationships with efficient transactions. The mall became the new town centre, drawing people away from Main Street's fading relevance. Mike and Elle's relationship had intensified over the months since the snowball into something that concerned Hopper for reasons both paternal and practical. The chief watched his adopted daughter spend every possible moment with Mike Wheeler, the two teenagers inseparable to a degree that eliminated time for other friendships or activities. Their codependency, while rooted in genuine affection and shared trauma, had begun limiting Elle's development of independence and broader social connections. Hopper's interference, clumsy and heavy-handed, involved threatening Mike with consequences designed to force distance between them. This manipulation, however well-intentioned, damaged trust and created resentment that would require time and honesty to repair. Dustin's return from science camp brought tales of his long-distance girlfriend Susie, stories his friends received with skepticism they attempted to mask as supportive interest. His insistence on her reality, combined with his inability to produce evidence of her existence, suggested either elaborate deception or self-delusion. The radio tower he had constructed on a nearby hill, however, demonstrated genuine technological skill, regardless of whether its intended recipient existed. This equipment, built to communicate with Susie in Utah, would prove valuable for purposes Dustin never anticipated when he was assembling components and running cables. Steve Harrington's employment at Scoops Ahoy, the mall's ice cream parlor, represented a significant descent from his previous social status as high school's most popular athlete. The sailor uniform he was required to wear, complete with shorts and neckerchief, humiliated him daily as former classmates and younger students witnessed his reduced circumstances. Robin Buckley, his co-worker, who had attended Hawkins High alongside him without ever penetrating his social circle, took evident pleasure in his discomfort. Their forced proximity during long shifts in the ice cream shop gradually transformed mutual irritation into genuine friendship, the kind that emerged when people moved past superficial impressions to recognize compatible personalities beneath. The Russian transmission Dustin intercepted while attempting to contact Susie consisted of coded language delivered in a Slavic accent that suggested origins far from Indiana. His excitement at discovering what appeared to be genuine espionage activity overcame his friend's skepticism about whether he had actually found evidence of Cold War intrigue or merely misinterpreted amateur radio chatter. Steve's recruitment into Dustin's investigation brought Robin along, her quick intelligence and linguistic knowledge making her invaluable for decoding the message. The translation they produced revealed coordinates and references to Silvercat, presumably a code name, that suggested the transmission originated somewhere within Hawkins itself. Lucas and Max's relationship cycled through breakups and reunions with exhausting frequency, each separation lasting hours or days before reconciliation restored their couple status. This pattern, while typical of early teenage romance, frustrated their friends, who tired of mediating disputes and hearing grievances about the other's behaviour. The underlying affection between them remained obvious despite the drama, their compatibility evident in moments when they forgot to maintain the defensive posturing that characterised their arguments. Their relationship's volatility reflected the difficulty of navigating romance while still developing individual identities and emotional regulation skills. Will's frustration with his friend's romantic preoccupations created distance he had not anticipated when the summer began. The campaigns and activities that had defined their friendship since childhood now competed with dating for his friend's attention and interest. His outburst about not wanting to grow up, about preferring their old dynamics to the new complications puberty had introduced, expressed grief for a simpler time that could not be recovered. The destruction of Castle Byers during a rainstorm, his childhood sanctuary literally collapsing under weather's assault, symbolised the ending of a phase he was not ready to relinquish. Nancy and Jonathan's summer internship at the Hawkins Post introduced them to workplace sexism that manifested in dismissive attitudes and demeaning assignments. Nancy's attempts to be taken seriously as a journalist met condescension from male reporters who viewed her as decoration rather than colleague. Her investigation into Mrs. Driscoll's peculiar story about diseased rats, pursued despite her editor's mockery, demonstrated the determination that had served her well during previous encounters with impossible situations. Jonathan's support, while genuine, could not fully shield her from the frustration of having her work undervalued because of her gender. Billy Hargrove's encounter at the community pool began as an ordinary evening shift and ended with his personality being supplanted by an external consciousness. The Mind Flayer's piece, which had survived when the gate closed by remaining on this side of the dimensional barrier, required human hosts to maintain presence and begin building the army it needed for invasion. Billy, driving home alone through darkness near the steel mill where the fragment had established itself, became the first victim of possession that would spread through Hawkins over subsequent weeks. His transformation from angry young man to puppet of malevolent intelligence occurred rapidly, his consciousness pushed aside, while something ancient and hungry assumed control of his physical form. The spreading infection moved through Hawkins with calculated strategy, Billy selecting victims who could be taken without immediate notice. Heather Holloway's abduction from the pool, accomplished through Billy's established relationship with her family, demonstrated how the Mind Flayer exploited social connections to gain access to new hosts. Each possessed individual contributed their knowledge and relationships to the hive consciousness, allowing it to identify optimal targets while avoiding detection by authorities or the group of teenagers who had previously interfered with its plans. The process of possession involved dragging victims to the steel mill, where the fragment waited to claim them through methods that left their bodies inhabited by its distributed awareness, while their original consciousness was consumed. Elle's powers had shown increasing strain throughout the summer, her abilities producing nosebleeds and exhaustion more severe than previous usage had caused. Mike's worry about her over-reliance on her gifts, his encouragement for her to rest rather than constantly demonstrating what she could do, reflected concern rooted in care rather than doubt. The connection between her declining abilities and the Russians' attempts to reopen the gate would not become clear until later, when the mechanical interference with dimensional barriers created feedback that destabilized psychic powers, dependent on accessing spaces between dimensions. Her headaches and weakening telekinesis signaled something systemically wrong rather than mere fatigue. Steve, Robin, Dustin, and eventually Erica Sinclair's infiltration of the Russian base beneath Starcourt began as reconnaissance and escalated into capture. Their discovery of the underground facility, accessed through storage areas connected to mall infrastructure, revealed an operation of staggering scope. The Russians had constructed a laboratory and containment chamber for technology designed to force open the gate that Elle had sealed. The massive machine they had built hummed with energy, its operation explaining the magnetic interference that had drawn Joyce and Hopper's attention through failing refrigerator magnets. The Americans' capture by Russian security forces, their interrogation involving drugs designed to extract information, placed them in mortal danger that required outside intervention to survive. The truth serum administered during Steve and Robin's interrogation produced honest responses to questions about American knowledge of dimensional breaches and previous encounters with the Upside Down. However, the drug also lowered inhibition sufficiently for Robin to share truths she had guarded carefully throughout her friendship with Steve. Her revelation that her interest in him during high school had stemmed from jealousy of his girlfriend rather than attraction to him. Her explanation that she was not romantically interested in boys generally marked a moment of vulnerability and trust. Steve's acceptance of this information without judgment or withdrawal, his immediate reassurance that her orientation changed nothing about their friendship, demonstrated the growth he had undergone from his earlier self-centered persona. Dustin's girlfriend proved real during the crisis, her voice emerging from radio static at the crucial moment when her knowledge was needed to overcome Russian security systems. Susie's insistence that Dustin sing their favourite song as payment for providing Planck's constant, the password required to access the locked system, created a surreal moment where musical theatre interrupted life-threatening emergency. Their duet of Never-Ending Story, broadcast across multiple radio frequencies, verified her existence to Dustin's friends while providing the information that enabled Hopper and Joyce to reach the Russian chamber beneath the mall. Joyce and Hopper's investigation into magnetic interference had led them to discover Russian involvement through circuitous path involving the capture of scientist Alexei. This engineer, coerced into working on the gate-opening project, provided crucial intelligence about the machine's purpose and location once Murray Bauman's translations overcame language barriers. Alexei's enthusiasm for American culture, his childlike joy at experiencing a 4th of July carnival, made his sudden death at the hands of Russian assassin particularly tragic. He had begun to hope for defection and freedom, only to have these possibilities eliminated by a bullet fired to prevent his continued cooperation with American authorities. The convergence of all storylines at Starcourt on the 4th of July brought together elements that had developed independently throughout the summer. The mall, packed with families celebrating the holiday, became a battlefield as the Mind Flayer's massive form, constructed from the liquefied bodies of dozens of possessed hosts, attacked through the building's skylights. Elle's confrontation with Billy, her attempt to reach the person he had been beneath the possession, revealed that some fragment of his consciousness remained aware and suffering within the hive mind's control. His internal struggle against the entity commanding him suggested that possession was not absolute, that human will could resist even when overwhelmed by superior force. The Mind Flayer's physical form represented Nightmare made manifest, a creature composed of stolen flesh, reorganized into configuration, designed for destruction rather than biological function. Its size exceeded the demogorgons that had preceded it, its strength derived from the multiple humans whose bodies had been consumed to create its mass. The creature's attack demolished portions of the mall, its tentacles smashing through walls and floors while hunting Elle specifically. The Mind Flayer's focus on her reflected both recognition of the threat she posed and desire for revenge against the being who had twice closed gates it attempted to use for invasion. Hopper and Joyce's desperate battle to reach the Russian control room required fighting through security forces determined to prevent interference with the machine. The device's operation had reached the critical phase, the beam it projected having nearly succeeded in tearing open the dimensional barrier once more. Grigory, the Russian operative who had killed Alexei and pursued them throughout their investigation, confronted Hopper in hand-to-hand combat that left both men injured and exhausted. Joyce, forced to continue alone while Hopper fought, reached the controls and faced the impossible choice between closing the machine and potentially trapping Hopper in the chamber when it exploded. Elle's complete loss of her powers occurred at the worst possible moment, the vessels in her leg bursting as she attempted one final push against the Mind Flayer's assault. The creature, sensing her vulnerability, moved to claim her, as it had claimed Billy and so many others. Billy's choice in this moment, his decision to stand between the Mind Flayer and Elle, despite the agony of resisting the entity's commands, represented redemption for the cruelty he had shown throughout his time in Hawkins. His sacrifice, using his body as a shield while the creature's tentacles pierced him repeatedly, bought time for the gate's closure, even as it ended his life. Joyce's decision to turn the keys that would destroy the Russian machine required accepting that Hopper could not escape the chamber before the resulting explosion consumed everything within it. Her hands shook as she looked through the window at the man who had become far more than a partner in investigation, the person with whom she had begun to build something resembling hope for a shared future. Hopper's nod, his acceptance that this was necessary despite personal cost, gave her permission to do what had to be done. The explosion that followed obliterated the Russian facility, severed the beam attempting to reopen the gate, and apparently killed everyone remaining in the chamber. The aftermath of that 4th of July evening saw Starcourt burning, the mall's destruction attributed to fire rather than interdimensional warfare. Emergency services responded to multiple casualties, while the cover story about Russian infiltration and sabotage began taking shape through government channels. Billy's body, recovered from the wreckage, received recognition as heroic sacrifice, his actual circumstances known only to those who had witnessed his final stand. The official narrative served to explain visible damage while concealing truths that would have shattered the town's remaining sense of security and normalcy. August brought grief instead of the usual anticipation of school's return. Joyce could not remain in the house she had shared with Bob's memory, and now with the added loss of Hopper. The accumulated tragedy making Hawkins unbearable. Elle, powerless and grieving the man she had called Dad, needed fresh start, away from laboratories and monsters, and painful reminders of what protecting others had cost. The Byers family's decision to move to California, taking Elle with them, represented both escape and exile. They would find safety in distance, but lose the community that had supported them through impossible trials. The airport's goodbye carried weight of futures uncertain, and friendships tested by separation. Mike and Elle's farewell, conducted with the awkwardness of teenagers experiencing profound loss while surrounded by adults and siblings, communicated more through embrace than words. Will's gift to Mike of his D&D drawings marked childhood's ending as adolescence truly began, both boys recognizing that their games and campaigns would never hold the same magic they had possessed before reality proved stranger and more dangerous than any fantasy. The party, forged through shared trauma and supernatural battle, now faced the prospect of functioning while geographically fractured. Hawkins appeared peaceful in the weeks following the Byers' departure, the mall's ruins being cleared while downtown businesses cautiously anticipated customers returning to establishments they had abandoned for Starcourt's convenience. The town had survived another brush with dimensional horror, this time at cost of lives and innocence that could not be recovered. Parents discussed the Russian infiltration with mixture of patriotic outrage and bewilderment that such things could occur in their quiet community. Students prepared for a school year that would feel different without Will and Elle, their absence noted by those who had known them and by those who had witnessed their involvement in events official stories could not fully explain. Yet beyond anyone's knowledge, in a Soviet prison facility located in Kamchatka's frozen wastes, guards brought food to cells housing political prisoners and captured enemies. One cell held a Demogorgon, kept for study and potential weaponization. Another held a prisoner referred to only as the American, his identity concealed, but his value to Russian intelligence apparently significant enough to justify imprisonment rather than execution. The Cold War's shadows extended far beyond Hawkins, connecting the small-town supernatural struggles to geopolitical conflicts that continued regardless of dimensional barriers or teenage heroes' victories. The battle had ended, but the war, as always, remained unfinished. The school year 1985-1986 unfolded, with the party divided for the first time since its formation. In Hawkins, Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Max navigated high school's freshman year, haunted by empty seats, where friends should be. In Lenora Hills, California, the Byers and Elle attempted to build normal lives far from supernatural terrors. Distance magnified grief, complicated relationships, and forced each to confront who they were without the group that had defined them. The separation that should have brought safety instead revealed how thoroughly their identities had become intertwined with shared trauma and the friendships that had sustained them through impossible trials. Mike's depression manifested in phone bills that horrified his parents and calls to California that grew increasingly strained as months passed. His conversations with Elle, initially frequent and lengthy, gradually shortened as they struggled to find common ground beyond missing each other. The distance exposed how little they actually knew about each other's daily lives, their relationship having been forged in crisis rather than ordinary adolescent interaction. His obsessive focus on maintaining connection to someone hundreds of miles away prevented him from fully engaging with the life he was living, his friends noticing his distraction, even as they respected his loyalty to Elle. Elle's struggle without her powers went beyond missing abilities she had possessed since childhood. Her entire identity had been constructed around what she could do, her value measured through demonstrations of telekinetic force and psychic projection. Stripped of these capabilities, she confronted the question of who Jane Hopper was when she could not move objects with her mind or project her consciousness across distances. The vulnerability she experienced navigating high school without supernatural protection forced her to develop ordinary coping mechanisms that her previous life had never required. Every social interaction became a test of skills she had never properly learned. Lenora Hills High School's size and diversity contrasted sharply with Hawkins's small-town homogeneity. Elle found herself invisible in hallways crowded with students from backgrounds she could not begin to understand. The social dynamics of teenage girls, with their unspoken rules and subtle hierarchies, proved more confusing than anything she had encountered in the Upside Down. Angela and her friends identified Elle as a target almost immediately, recognizing the awkwardness and isolation that marked her as vulnerable to ridicule. The bullying began with mockery of her outdated clothing and unsophisticated understanding of current trends, escalating gradually to crueler forms of social torture. Will's relief at being away from Hawkins surprised him with its intensity. California offered anonymity, the absence of people who knew his history as the boy who had vanished and returned, changed. He could attend school without classmates whispering about his episodes or treating him as fragile. His artistic talents, which had always been present but overshadowed by supernatural crises, flourished in Lenora's more diverse environment. The art program appreciated his technical skill and unique perspective, providing validation he had not received in Hawkins, where his drawings had primarily served as maps to tunnels or communications from alternate dimensions. Yet his sense of being different, of carrying experiences that set him apart from peers, persisted despite geographic relocation. Joyce attempted to provide stability while grieving Hopper's loss. Her nights often spent staring at the ceiling and wondering if she could have made different choices that might have saved him. Her job search in California proved difficult, her resume showing years of retail work and no college degree limiting options. Jonathan, recognizing his mother's struggle, took on more family responsibility than any 17-year-old should carry. He worked part-time while maintaining his studies, helped Will adjust to the new school, and provided what support he could to Elle as she navigated socialization without the brother-sister dynamic they had developed. The weight of holding the family together aged him in ways that went beyond the months marked by calendars. Max's grief over Billy, complicated by her awareness of who he had been before the Mind Flayer's possession. She mourned not the idealized brother, but the complicated person who had been both victim and perpetrator, whose cruelty toward her had stemmed from abuse he himself had suffered. This nuanced grief found no outlet in conversations with adults who offered platitudes about tragic loss, without understanding the relief mixed with her sorrow. Her isolation from Lucas and the others intensified as autumn turned to winter, her depression manifesting in withdrawal from activities and relationships that had previously anchored her. The Walkman that had saved her life became a tool for blocking out the world, Kate Bush's voice providing escape from emotions too large and contradictory to process. Lucas's focus on basketball reflected his desire for normalcy and acceptance within high school social structures. His athletic talent earned him consideration for the varsity team despite being a freshman, an achievement that came with pressure to distance himself from associations that might damage his reputation. The conflict between his genuine love for his friends and his equally genuine desire to be popular created internal tension he struggled to articulate. His attempts to maintain connection with Max while she actively pushed him away tested his patience and understanding, each rejected offer of support confirming his growing sense that he could not help someone who would not accept help. Dustin and Susie's long-distance relationship thrived in ways that surprised those who had initially doubted her existence. Their regular radio communications, scheduled with the precision of two people who understood technology and valued their connection, provided both with emotional support and intellectual companionship. Susie's Mormon faith and Utah upbringing meant their relationship remained strictly platonic, conducted entirely through voice communication and shared interests in science and mathematics. This constraint, which might have frustrated another teenage boy, suited Dustin perfectly. His appreciation for genuine connection over physical interaction, reflecting maturity beyond his years. Steve Harrington's post-high school life consisted of working at Family Video alongside Robin and attempting to determine what future awaited someone whose athletic talent had not translated into college scholarships. His job applications to various retail and service positions demonstrated the reality that popularity in high school meant nothing beyond graduation. Robin's presence made the work tolerable, their friendship having deepened into the kind of platonic intimacy rare between people of different genders. Her coming out had freed her to be fully herself around him, while Steve's acceptance had proven to Robin that genuine male friendship was possible without romantic complications. Nancy's experience at Emerson College revealed worlds beyond Hawkins she'd only glimpsed previously. Her journalism program challenged her intellectually while providing community of peers who shared her ambitions. The distance from Jonathan, while difficult, allowed her to develop identity separate from their relationship, to explore interests and friendships without constantly negotiating couple dynamics. Their phone calls, initially frequent, began spacing out as their lives diverged, each conversation highlighting how different their daily experiences had become. The strain, while not yet critical, suggested futures that might not converge as naturally as they had once assumed. Jonathan's decision to defer college acceptance and remain in California with his family represented sacrifice he made without resentment but not without cost. His photography, once pursued with passion and hope for artistic career, became secondary to earning money and supporting his mother and siblings. The photographs he took in spare moments captured California landscapes and Elle's attempts to understand her new environment, documenting their adjustment while his own dreams remained on indefinite hold. His relationship with Nancy, maintained through increasingly awkward phone calls, suffered from the reality that their circumstances had diverged so dramatically that shared understanding became difficult to maintain. Murray helping Joyce with private inquiries represented his own form of processing Hopper's loss, the gruff conspiracy theorist having developed genuine affection for the chief despite their brief acquaintance. His investigation into Russian activities and continued analysis of Starcourt events was conducted partly from belief that understanding what had occurred might prevent future occurrences. His growing suspicion that Hopper might have survived the explosion, based on the absence of recovered remains and knowledge of Russian propensity for taking valuable prisoners rather than killing them, was dismissed by Joyce as grief-talking. She could not allow herself hope that would only deepen pain when proven false. Hawkins rebuilt through autumn and winter, the town's resilience tested but intact. The Starcourt ruins were cleared, though plans for replacement remained contested. Some advocated rebuilding the mall, others argued for returning the land to local businesses or community purposes. Downtown stores experienced modest recovery as customers returned, though the convenience and variety of mall shopping had permanently altered expectations. The town's trauma remained largely unprocessed, residents speaking of Russian infiltration and heroic responses without addressing the underlying strangeness that defied conventional explanation. Those who knew the truth maintained silence through combination of self-preservation and recognition that revelation would serve no useful purpose. The Creel House, Hawkins' abandoned murder site from 1959, remained local legend that few investigated beyond teenage dares. The connection between that decades-old tragedy and recent events went unnoticed by everyone, except those with access to classified information. Victor Creel, institutionalized since his family's death, remained in psychiatric care, his claims of demonic presence dismissed as delusions. The house itself stood empty, its windows broken and structure deteriorating, avoided by those who felt instinctively that something about the location was wrong in ways that had nothing to do with its violent history. In Kamchatka, Hopper's survival came at cost of freedom and dignity. The Russian prison's brutal conditions, the hard labor demanded of prisoners in sub-zero temperatures, the guards' casual violence, all tested his will to survive. Dmitri, a guard who showed occasional humanity and saw possibility for profit in helping American prisoner escape, represented Hopper's best chance at eventual freedom. Their tentative alliance, built on Dmitri's greed and Hopper's desperation, required patience and planning. The method of communicating with Joyce to alert her of his survival required resources and opportunities not yet available, leaving him isolated in frozen prison while those he loved believed him dead. Elle's desperation to regain her powers manifested in private attempts to access abilities that had defined her entire existence. She stared at objects for hours, focusing with the intensity that had once moved mountains, achieving nothing beyond headaches and frustration. Her attempts to project her consciousness into the void met only darkness and silence. The possibility that her powers were permanently gone, that the vessels that had burst during the Starcourt battle had severed her connection to whatever source fueled her abilities, terrified her more than any monster she had faced. Without her powers, she was ordinary, defenseless, unable to protect those she loved or justify the sacrifices others had made for her safety. Will's visions began again subtly in December, a familiar tingling at the back of his neck that he initially dismissed as phantom sensation or psychological artifact of trauma. The feeling grew gradually stronger through winter, accompanied by moments where his awareness seemed to extend beyond his body into spaces that felt wrong and cold. His decision not to mention these episodes to his mother or brother stemmed from understanding that reporting them would mean returning to Hawkins, to medical testing and questions, and the renewed status as victim rather than person. He convinced himself that the sensations were psychosomatic, that distance from Hawkins meant safety from the Upside Down's influence. This self-deception, while understandable, represented denial that would later prove costly. Vecna's planning proceeded beyond anyone's awareness through these months, his consciousness operating in the Upside Down, while reaching carefully toward victims in Hawkins, whose trauma and guilt made them vulnerable to his curse. His methodology required time and careful selection, identifying targets whose psychological wounds created openings for his influence. The connection between his victims' emotional states and his ability to reach them across dimensional barriers reflected an intelligence that understood human psychology as thoroughly as it understood the manipulation of reality itself. His patience, cultivated through years of existence in a dimension where time moved differently, allowed him to prepare methodically for the moment when conditions would favour his emergence. March 1986 approached, with the party members scattered and struggling in ways they could not fully articulate to each other during their occasional phone calls. Mike planned his spring break visit to California with excitement tempered by awareness that Elle had seemed distant during recent conversations, her responses brief and lacking the warmth he remembered. Max isolated herself further, her refusal to engage with friends or activities concerning Lucas, but beyond his ability to penetrate. Dustin maintained his optimism, despite missing the dynamic that had made their group special, believing that summer would bring reunion and restoration of what distance had strained. In Russia, Hopper endured another day of captivity, unaware that Joyce had begun questioning whether she had actually seen him die or only assumed his death because the alternative was too painful to hope for. In Lenora Hills, Elle faced another day of high school humiliation without powers to protect herself, her isolation complete, despite being surrounded by people. Will felt the familiar tingle at his neck and pushed it away, desperate for normal life to continue without supernatural complications. The peace they had fought for in Hawkins had come at cost of their togetherness, the unity that had made them powerful, fractured by geography and individual struggles. Soon, however, new horrors would force reunion. The scattered party would need to remember how to function as the unified force that had twice saved their town. The bonds forged in basements and battles would be tested by distance and time, but ultimately would prove stronger than the forces attempting to sever them. Spring break would bring not just Mike's visit to California, but the beginning of their most difficult challenge. Yet, one that would require every lesson they had learned and every connection they had maintained despite separation's attempts to weaken them. March 21st, 1986 began ordinarily enough in Hawkins. High school basketball preparations dominated conversations among students anticipating the championship game that would determine whether their team brought home the trophy. Spring weather had arrived with pleasant temperatures that encouraged outdoor activities after months of winter cold. Teenagers navigated the universal struggles of adolescence. Their concerns focused on grades, relationships, and social hierarchies that felt monumentally important within their limited experience. By midnight, Chrissy Cunningham, popular cheerleader carrying secret pain beneath her perfect surface, would die in impossible fashion, while Eddie Munson watched helplessly. This murder marked the beginning of Vecna's curse, a killing pattern that would reveal the Upside Down's most dangerous resident and force Hawkins' protectors to confront their own deepest traumas. Chrissy's approach to Eddie seeking drugs represented desperation rather than recreational interest. The visions that had been tormenting her, images of her mother transformed into monster and memories warped into nightmare versions of themselves, had driven her to seek anything that might provide escape or relief. Eddie Munson, leader of Hawkins High's Hellfire Club, a known dealer of substances ranging from harmless to concerning, recognized genuine distress beneath her request. Their interaction in the woods behind the school parking lot was transactional, but not unkind. Eddie's instinct to help overriding his usual wariness of popular students who typically ignored or mocked him. His invitation to his trailer to retrieve stronger product than he carried with him was motivated by compassion as much as profit. The entity that claimed Chrissy in Eddie's trailer operated through methods that defied physical laws and medical explanation. She rose from the floor where she'd been sitting, lifted by invisible force until she hovered near the ceiling. Her eyes rolled back, consciousness leaving her body as her awareness was pulled into a mental realm where Vecna waited. The breaking of her bones occurred systematically, each limb snapping with sounds that would haunt Eddie's nightmares. Her jaw dislocated, her eyes collapsed inward, the sockets suddenly empty. The body that fell back to the floor bore no external wounds that would explain death, yet life had been extracted completely, leaving only a shell arranged in a position suggesting agony beyond comprehension. Eddie's flight from his trailer and subsequent hiding reflected terror, combined with awareness that no one would believe his account of what he had witnessed. A known drug dealer whose trailer contained a dead cheerleader would be convicted immediately in public opinion, regardless of actual circumstances. His disappearance before police arrived eliminated any possibility of presenting his innocence through proper channels, marking him as fugitive and primary suspect. The town's immediate acceptance of Eddie's guilt demonstrated how readily people believed the worst about those who existed on society's margins, whose clothing and interests marked them as different and therefore dangerous. Dustin and the others' determination to prove Eddie's innocence stemmed from their knowledge that impossible things occurred in Hawkins with disturbing regularity. Their investigation began with locating Eddie, tracking him to Rick's abandoned lake house through logical deduction about where a person in his situation might hide. The discovery of their friend, terrified and traumatized, insisting he had witnessed supernatural murder rather than committing conventional crime, aligned with patterns they recognized from previous encounters. Dustin's immediate belief in Eddie's story, his acceptance that something from the Upside Down was responsible, provided Eddie with the first support he had received since fleeing. The decision to keep him hidden while investigating rather than turning him over to authorities represented trust in their own judgment over official systems that had failed them repeatedly. Max's investigation incorporated journalistic techniques learned from Nancy combined with her own understanding of trauma's effects. Her visit to the school counselor, under pretense of seeking help, allowed her to access files on other students, discovering that both Chrissy and Fred Benson, the second victim, had been experiencing symptoms matching her own recent struggles. The headaches, the nightmares, the visions of traumatic memories twisted into worse versions than reality had produced, all indicated a pattern suggesting the killer selected victims according to psychological criteria. Max's realization that she fit this pattern perfectly, that her guilt over Billy's death and her depression made her vulnerable to whatever was hunting traumatized teenagers, transformed investigation from academic exercise into survival imperative. The connection to Victor Creel emerged through research into Hawkins' historical murders, cases that had seemed unrelated to recent supernatural events, but shared too many similarities to dismiss as coincidence. The 1959 massacre of the Creel family, attributed to the father despite his protests that a demon had been responsible, featured the same peculiar details as Chrissy's death. Bones broken without external force, eyes destroyed from within. Victor's descriptions of experiencing waking nightmares before his family's deaths matched what victims were reporting before Vecna claimed them. Nancy and Robin's decision to interview Victor Creel at the psychiatric hospital, where he had been institutionalized for decades, represented their best opportunity to understand what they faced. Victor's account, delivered with the conviction of someone who had spent 27 years being told his memories were delusions, described an entity that entered minds and destroyed from within. His survival, while his wife and daughter died, had resulted from music playing on the radio during his own vision, the sound somehow anchoring his consciousness to reality and preventing the demon from completing its work. This detail, seemingly minor in Victor's narrative, would prove crucial to developing defensive strategies. The revelation that Victor's son, Henry, had survived the massacre but disappeared afterward suggested connections Nancy and Robin could not yet fully understand. Fred Benson's death at the edge of the forest confirmed that Vecna was actively hunting rather than randomly claiming victims. Fred, who had been experiencing guilt over a car accident he had caused the previous year, fit the pattern of traumatized individuals whose psychological wounds created vulnerability. His death, witnessed by Nancy from distance that prevented intervention, demonstrated the curse's speed once the entity had fully engaged with a victim's consciousness. The time from Fred's eyes going vacant to his body breaking lasted mere minutes, insufficient time for rescue even when observers were present. The town's response to multiple gruesome deaths shifted from shock to hysteria, fueled by residents' need to identify explicable causes for inexplicable events. The satanic panic that had simmered in American culture throughout the 1980s found perfect expression in Hawkins' crisis. Eddie Munson's leadership of Hellfire Club, a Dungeons and Dragons group that conservative parents already viewed with suspicion, transformed him from mere murder suspect into symbol of occult evil supposedly corrupting youth. Jason Carver, whose girlfriend Chrissy's death had shattered his world, embraced this narrative with fervent conviction, organizing vigilante hunts and spreading accusations that replaced rational investigation with righteous fury. The realization that Max had become Vecna's next target created urgency that overrode all other considerations. Her symptoms had progressed to the point where she experienced full dissociative episodes, her consciousness pulled into the cursed visions that preceded death. The party's desperate brainstorming to identify methods of protection led to recalling Victor Creel's survival through music. Max's immediate selection of Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill reflected both the song's personal significance and her instinctive understanding that emotional connection to the music mattered as much as the sound itself. The Walkman that became her constant companion, headphones always within reach, represented fragile defense against an enemy that attacked through consciousness rather than physical force. The decision to use Max as bait, allowing her to enter vision state while the others stood ready to deploy music and pull her back, reflected calculated risk based on incomplete understanding of what they faced. Her willingness to put herself in mortal danger for the opportunity to learn about their enemy demonstrated courage that had nothing to do with supernatural powers or physical strength. The letters she wrote to each person important in her life, sealed envelopes distributed with instructions to open only if she died, prepared for the possibility that the plan would fail and her sacrifice would be final. These letters, particularly the one addressed to Lucas, contained emotional honesty she'd been unable to express directly. her anticipated death freeing her to acknowledge feelings that vulnerability had previously kept hidden. Steve, Nancy, Robin, and Eddie's investigation of the Creel house provided physical focus, while others pursued psychological understanding of Vecna's methodology. The abandoned structure had been avoided by Hawkins residents for decades, its reputation as haunted, discouraging even teenage explorers from extended visits. The interior, preserved in decay since 1959, contained rooms where the Creel family had lived and died. The explorers' discovery of a portal into the Upside Down within the house confirmed connection between Victor's demon and the dimension that had threatened Hawkins repeatedly. Their decision to cross through, to investigate this nightmare version of reality, placed them directly in Vecna's territory. The Upside Down's temporal stasis, frozen at the moment Will had first been taken in November 1983, raised questions about the dimension's nature that no one present could adequately answer. Everything existed exactly as it had that night. Nancy's bedroom containing decorations and possessions from years earlier, unchanged despite time's passage in the normal world. This temporal fixation suggested that the gate's opening had created anchor point, that the Upside Down had somehow imprinted Hawkins as it existed at that specific moment. The discovery of Vecna's lair within this frozen landscape revealed a conscious entity making deliberate choices about location and presentation rather than mindless force acting on instinct. Eddie and Dustin's bonding during their role as lookouts created friendship between individuals who would never have connected under normal social circumstances. Eddie's metalhead aesthetic and Dustin's nerd enthusiasm represented different expressions of nonconformity that made each a target of mainstream judgment. Their conversation, while waiting in the stolen RV, discussions of music and movies and the unfairness of high school social hierarchies, built genuine affection. Eddie's admission that he always ran when faced with danger, his shame about this pattern, revealed vulnerability that Dustin addressed with assurance that survival was not cowardice, but wisdom. This exchange planted seeds of Eddie's later determination to prove he could stand and fight when circumstances demanded heroism. Steve's near death from the Demobat swarm demonstrated that the Upside Down contained multiple predatory species operating under Vecna's coordination. These flying creatures attacked with coordinated efficiency, their tails wrapping around Steve's neck, while fangs tore into his torso. His rescue required Nancy and Robin fighting desperately with whatever weapons they could improvise, their success coming at cost of Steve's significant injury. The episode reinforced that physical danger remained present alongside psychological threats, that Vecna commanded an arsenal of attack methods beyond his curse. Nancy's abduction into Vecna's vision, while the group attempted retreat from the Upside Down, provided their first direct contact with the entity responsible for the murders. Her experience in the mental realm revealed Vecna not as simple monster, but as something that had once been human. His presentation of himself, the scarred and twisted form he had become through years in the Upside Down, suggested transformation rather than inherent monstrosity. The visions he forced Nancy to witness, images of Hawkins destroyed and consumed by the Upside Down spread, communicated his intentions more clearly than threats could have. He wanted her to carry this message back, to let Hawkins know that their destruction was coming and that resistance would prove futile. In California, Elle's arrest following the roller rink incident marked the culmination of months of bullying and her inability to defend herself through supernatural means. Angela's public humiliation, presenting a slideshow mocking Elle's deceased father during what was supposed to be a fun outing, had triggered rage that Elle channeled through physical rather than psychic action. The roller skate she swung at Angela's face resulted in serious injury that brought police involvement despite the provocation that had preceded it. Mike's witness to Elle defending herself through violence rather than powers, confirmed what he had suspected, that her abilities remained absent, and her vulnerability was complete. Dr. Sam Owen's arrival with an offer to restore Elle's powers represented both opportunity and risk. Project Nina, the program he proposed, would require Elle's return to sensory deprivation tank work, to techniques that resembled those Brenner had employed during her childhood. Owens's assurance that the methods had been refined, that her participation would be voluntary and she could withdraw at any time, addressed concerns without fully alleviating them. Elle's decision to accept reflected desperation to regain the abilities that had defined her identity and to help her friends facing danger in Hawkins without her protection. The facility where Project Nana operated, hidden in Nevada desert and staffed by personnel who viewed Elle with mixture of fear and fascination, recreated elements of Hawkins' lab while attempting to avoid its worst abuses. The tank sessions began with guided memory work, Owens's team helping Elle access psychological states associated with her power usage. The breakthrough came when they recognized that her abilities had never been purely psychic, but were rooted in relived trauma. The memories she had suppressed, particularly those surrounding the 1979 massacre, held keys to understanding both her power's origins and their restoration. The flashbacks revealed through Nina's memory recovery process exposed truths that reconstructed Elle's understanding of her past completely. The orderly who had been kind to her during her early years at the lab, the young man who had encouraged her gentleness and protected her from Brenner's harshest demands, was revealed as Henry Creel, the son who had survived his family's massacre. Henry had been Brenner's first success, a child whose natural psychic abilities had been identified and cultivated. His designation as 1, the original numbered subject, established him as template for all who followed. 1's manipulation of Elle throughout her childhood, his grooming designed to turn her against Brenner and the other children, demonstrated patience and calculation that had seemed like genuine care to a child desperate for kindness. His revelation that he had killed the other subjects, that the 1979 massacre had been his work rather than Elle's, reframed her most traumatic memory. The battle between them that day, child against adult, powerless against powerful, had concluded with Elle somehow overpowering him. Her telekinetic force had not killed 1, but banished him, sending him through a portal into the Upside Down, where his body and mind had been twisted by the dimension's nature into the entity now known as Vecna. This revelation connected every threat Hawkins had faced to a single source. The Mind Flayer was not a separate entity, but Vecna's creation or extension. His consciousness expanded and amplified through connection with the Upside Down's hive structure. The Demogorgons were his weapons. The tunnels, the possessions, the gates all served his ultimate purpose of opening pathways for invasion. Elle's realization that she created this threat through her act of defense, that her power had birthed the enemy, now threatening everyone she loved, brought guilt that Owens had to address carefully, lest it interfere with her continued progress. Brenner's presence at the facility, revealed after Elle had committed to the program, represented betrayal that complicated her relationship with Owens and the entire project. The doctor, who had tortured and manipulated her, whom she believed dead after Starcourt, had been quietly working with government agencies throughout the interim. His insistence on being called Papa, his attempts to resume the relationship dynamic from her childhood, met with Elle's furious rejection. Yet Brenner's expertise proved necessary for the memory work's completion, his understanding of her psychology and power's mechanisms exceeding anyone else's knowledge. This forced collaboration tested Elle's commitment to recovering her abilities against her desire to completely sever connections to her traumatic past. The restoration of Elle's powers occurred gradually through the Nina process, her telekinetic abilities returning first in small manifestations and building as she processed memories and integrated suppressed experiences. The moment she could move objects with her mind again brought relief so profound she wept, the return of this fundamental aspect of herself, confirming that she remained who she had been, despite months of powerlessness. The strengthening continued through subsequent sessions, her abilities eventually exceeding pre-Star Court levels. The process of reclaiming powers through confronting trauma rather than merely exercising them created stronger foundation than Brenner's original conditioning had achieved. The facility's attack by military forces operating on orders Elle did not understand created crisis that forced early termination of the Nina program. Brenner's attempts to prevent Elle's departure, his insistence that she needed more time under his supervision, revealed that his concern was less for her welfare than for retaining control over his greatest achievement. The confrontation between them, Elle's declaration that he had never been her father despite his papa designation, marked her final rejection of the man who had shaped her childhood. Brenner's death during the facility evacuation removed him permanently from her life, though not before he attempted one last time to claim paternal relationship she had never truly shared with him. Mike's declaration of love, through the letter Argyle delivered, his articulation of everything Elle meant to him beyond her powers or usefulness, provided emotional foundation that strengthened her resolve. The reassurance that she was loved for herself, rather than her abilities, addressed insecurities that had plagued her since losing her powers. This confirmation of Mike's feelings, combined with her restored capabilities, prepared Elle for the confrontation she knew awaited in Hawkins. The journey back to Indiana would require coordination with Owen's remaining contacts and transportation arrangements, but Elle's determination to reach her friends overrode concerns about logistics or remaining legal issues from her arrest. In Kamchatka, Joyce's realization that Hopper might be alive came through a package delivery she initially assumed was cruel prank. The Russian nesting doll, when opened, contained a note written in code she and Hopper had established during their investigation of Russian infiltration. The message's authenticity was confirmed through details only Hopper could know, convincing Joyce that the impossible was true. Her immediate shift from grief to desperate planning demonstrated the single-minded focus that had characterized her response to every previous crisis. The rescue operation would require resources and assistance beyond her capabilities alone, leading her to recruit Murray Bauman, whose Russian language skills and intelligence contacts made him essential to any extraction attempt. Yuri Izmailov, the smuggler and pilot they contacted through Murray's network, represented the kind of morally flexible operator who could navigate between legitimate and criminal spheres as circumstances required. His willingness to assist was motivated purely by financial incentive rather than humanitarian concern, his fee for flying Joyce and Murray to Russia and facilitating prison infiltration representing most of Joyce's available resources. The risk of trusting someone whose loyalty extended only as far as payment was acknowledged and accepted as necessary, the alternatives being governmental involvement that would take too long or abandoning Hopper to indefinite imprisonment. The infiltration of the Soviet prison facility required exploiting Dmitri's position as guard and his willingness to facilitate escape in exchange for passage to America and financial compensation. The plan involved multiple contingencies and points where failure would result in imprisonment or death for all involved. Joyce's courage in entering hostile foreign nation to rescue someone officials had declared dead demonstrated the fierce loyalty that defined her character. The prison's conditions, revealed during their approach, shocked even Murray's cynicism. The brutal treatment of inmates, the forced labor in conditions that routinely killed prisoners, the casual violence of guards, all confirmed that Hopper's survival had required strength and will beyond normal human endurance. The discovery that the prison maintained a captured Demogorgon for study and potential weaponization added supernatural complication to political intrigue. The Soviets' possession of this creature suggested their research into dimensional phenomena had continued despite the Starcourt facility's destruction. Hopper's forced participation in gladiatorial combat against the Demogorgon, entertainment for guards, and test of prisoners' durability had become regular occurrence during his months of captivity. His survival of these encounters demonstrated adaptation and combat skills developed through desperate necessity. The reunion between Joyce and Hopper, occurring in circumstances of continued danger rather than safety, was marked by relief tempered with awareness that escape remained uncertain. The convergence of all storylines in Hawkins required coordination across vast distances and significant obstacles. Elle's journey from Nevada, accompanied by Argyle, Mike, Will, and Jonathan, encountered delays that prevented her arrival during the initial crisis. The California group's desperation to reach Hawkins before Max's scheduled bait attempt created tension that could not be fully resolved through speed alone. Meanwhile, those in Hawkins prepared for battle with incomplete information and inadequate resources, trusting that their experience and determination would suffice against enemy they did not fully understand. Max's walk into Vecna's mental realm occurred according to plan, her consciousness pulled into the dark landscape where the entity waited. The vision he presented showed her worst memories amplified. Billy's death replayed with her guilt, magnified beyond reasonable proportion. Lucas and Erica's protection of her physical body became complicated when Jason and his teammates arrived, their vigilante mission having tracked the group to the abandoned house. Jason's accusation that Lucas was involved in satanic ritual, his physical attack while Max lay vulnerable, demonstrated how dangerous mob mentality could become when fueled by grief and righteous certainty. In the Upside Down, Steve, Nancy, Robin, and Eddie executed their assault on Vecna's physical form while he concentrated on Max's consciousness. The coordinated attack exploited the entity's divided attention, his focus on claiming Max leaving him vulnerable to physical damage. Nancy's shotgun blasts tore into flesh that had ceased being entirely human, each wound temporarily disrupting his concentration and weakening his hold on Max. The battle tested their courage, as Vecna's power, even while distracted, proved formidable enough to threaten them all with death similar to what his cursed victims had suffered. Eddie and Dustin's distraction operation, using amplified guitar music, Master of Puppets played through equipment that should not have worked in the Upside Down, but did through sheer defiant will, drew the Demobat swarm away from the others. Eddie's performance atop the trailer, his final tribute to the metal music he had always loved, bought time measured in minutes but crucial to the overall plan's success. When the bats broke through their defenses, Eddie's decision to stand and fight rather than run represented the courage he had always possessed but never before demonstrated. His injuries, sustained while protecting Dustin, proved fatal despite Dustin's desperate attempts to stem bleeding and maintain hope. Elle's remote connection to Max in the Void allowed her to join the battle despite physical distance separating them. Her projection of consciousness across hundreds of miles demonstrated abilities restored and enhanced through Nina's process. The confrontation between Elle and Vecna occurred simultaneously, in mental realm and physical location, her psychic force battling his, while their bodies remained separated by geography. Vecna's revelation of his philosophy, his belief that humanity represented plague deserving extermination, and that he would reshape the world according to his vision, communicated motivations beyond simple malevolence. He saw himself as savior rather than monster, convinced that his actions served greater good even as they required mass destruction. Max's brief escape from Vecna's hold, achieved through Kate Bush's music, and her memories of happy moments with Lucas and her friends, demonstrated that the curse could be resisted through emotional anchoring to positive experiences. Her return to consciousness, gasping and crying but alive, seemed to indicate success. The celebration proved premature, as Vecna, weakened but not defeated, struck once more with reserves she had not anticipated. The second assault broke her more thoroughly than the first, her limbs snapping, her eyes collapsing, her consciousness fleeing the body that could no longer sustain it. Lucas's desperate cries as she died in his arms expressed helplessness and grief beyond his capacity to process. Elle's intervention, channeling everything she possessed into restarting Max's heart, represented power, used not for destruction but for healing. The psychic force required to reach across death and pull someone back exceeded anything Elle had previously attempted. Her success came at cost of leaving Max's consciousness displaced, alive, but not present, her awareness having fled to location beyond Elle's ability to reach. Max's revival kept her body functioning, her heart beating and lungs breathing, but left her in coma with prognosis uncertain. The victory was partial, Max saved from death but not restored to life as it had been lived. The 4 gates that opened across Hawkins, spreading from each murder site and converging at the Creel house, tore the town apart literally and figuratively. The massive earthquake that resulted from dimensional barriers failing sent residents fleeing their homes in panic. Buildings collapsed, roads split. The downtown area, already struggling economically, sustained damage that would require years to repair if rebuilding was even attempted. The rifts themselves, glowing wounds in reality that allowed the Upside Down's atmosphere to bleed into the normal world, created exclusion zones where the air itself became toxic to human life. The evacuation of affected areas proceeded chaotically, families gathering what possessions they could carry and fleeing toward relief centers established in schools and churches. The official explanation, earthquake resulting from geological instability, satisfied those who needed rational explanation while failing to address evidence visible to anyone who approached the rifts. The particles drifting from the tiers between worlds, the vines beginning to spread from the gate locations, the way electronics failed near the boundaries, all suggested something beyond natural disaster had occurred. 2 days after the gates opened, the groups finally reunited amid destruction and relief efforts. Elle and Mike's embrace, Joyce and her son's tearful reunion, Hopper's return from apparent death shocking everyone who had mourned him. These moments of joy occurred against backdrop of devastation and loss. Eddie's absence, his body left in the Upside Down during desperate escape, meant there would be no hero's acknowledgement of his sacrifice. Hawkins would continue believing him a murderer rather than defender. Max's coma, her body breathing but her consciousness absent, cast shadow over reunions that should have been purely celebratory. The town's physical scars mirrored psychological damage that would require generations to heal. The gate system spreading from Creel House created permanent alteration to Hawkins' geography and atmosphere. Plants near the rifts withered and died despite spring's arrival. The sky above the convergence point roiled with clouds that never fully dispersed. Will's sensation of Vecna's presence, his declaration that the entity had survived and was growing stronger, confirmed that the battle had not ended but merely paused. The spring of 1986 concluded with Hawkins fractured in ways that reconstruction could not fully repair. Families displaced to emergency shelters questioned whether to return or abandon the town entirely. The government provided explanations that satisfied official records, while anyone with eyes could see that something impossible had occurred. In hospitals, Max drifted in unconsciousness, while Elle visited daily, attempting to locate her friend's awareness in the void and finding only emptiness. The group that had saved Hawkins 3 times now faced the recognition that their enemy had not been defeated but had accomplished significant goals despite their opposition. Vecna's survival meant the war they had feared was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and the opening moves had gone to the adversary, who had planned for decades while they had merely reacted to immediate crises. The final confrontation, when it came, would require everything they had learned, everyone they had become, and likely demand sacrifices even greater than those already paid. The aftermath of spring 1986 left Hawkins as a town divided between those who fled and those who stayed to fight. Families packed belongings into vehicles and departed for cities where earthquakes did not tear reality apart, where the air remained breathable and skies stayed clear. Those who remained did so from various motivations, some bound by financial inability to relocate, others by stubborn attachment to homes their families had occupied for generations, still others by recognition that whatever threatened Hawkins might eventually threaten everywhere. The party scattered no more, prepared for confrontation that had been building since a boy first vanished on a November night in 1983. Every battle, every loss, every hard-won victory had led toward this moment when understanding what connection between worlds truly meant would determine not just Hawkins' survival, but potentially humanity's future. The town's immediate condition required triage before strategy. The four rifts spreading from convergence points had created zones where normal life could not continue. Homes nearest the tiers stood abandoned, their interiors contaminated by particles drifting from the upside down. The relief efforts centered at the high school brought together residents who had previously existed in separate social circles, shared crisis temporarily overriding divisions of class and status. Volunteers distributed supplies, organized shelter rotations, and attempted to maintain community cohesion, while authorities offered explanations that satisfied paperwork without addressing reality. Those who had witnessed impossible things maintained careful silence, aware that certain truths invited responses ranging from dismissal to institutionalization. Max's uncertain fate haunted everyone who loved her, particularly Elle and Lucas. The girl who had survived Vecna's curse through music and determination now lay in hospital bed, her body technically alive, but her consciousness absent from the void where Elle searched. Nightly, the medical staff monitoring her vital signs could offer no explanation for her condition beyond coma, their instruments detecting brain activity but unable to map where her awareness had retreated. Elle's desperate attempts to locate Max through psychic projection met only emptiness, suggesting that her friend existed somewhere beyond dimensions Elle could access, perhaps held in place Vecna had created specifically to trap those who escaped death but could not fully return to life. The determination to save Max provided emotional motivation alongside tactical necessity. Elle understood that Max's consciousness, wherever it resided, represented both person she loved and potential weakness in Vecna's defenses. If the entity was expending energy maintaining Max in her suspended state, that suggested she mattered to his plans or posed threat he needed to contain. The possibility that freeing Max might weaken Vecna while restoring their friend created dual purpose for rescue attempts. Yet accessing wherever Max's awareness had been sequestered would require understanding Vecna's capabilities and the Upside Down's nature more completely than they currently possessed. Vecna's survival, confirmed through Will's continued sensitivity to the Upside Down's presence, meant their enemy remained active, despite the damage sustained during the spring confrontation. His weakened state offered temporary advantage, a window during which preparation and planning might create conditions for his eventual defeat. However, time favoured Vecna rather than his opponents. The longer the gates remained open, the more the Upside Down bled into Hawkins, the stronger his position became. The vines spreading from the rifts, the particles contaminating air and water, the creatures that occasionally emerged to hunt before retreating, all demonstrated that dimensional barriers' failure was ongoing process rather than completed event. The mind flayer's role in whatever final conflict approached remained subject to interpretation. Whether it represented separate entity with which Vecna had allied, extension of Vecna's consciousness amplified through the upside-down's hive structure, or something Vecna had created or corrupted, determining this relationship mattered for understanding what they faced. If the mind flayer possessed independent agency, appeals to its self-interest might create division between it and Vecna. If it was merely Vecna's tool, then defeating the source would eliminate the threat comprehensively. Will's unique connection to both entities, his time possessed and his continued sensitivity, positioned him as crucial asset for intelligence gathering, despite the psychological cost of maintaining that connection. The true nature of the Upside Down itself remained among the most significant mysteries requiring resolution. Whether the dimension had always existed parallel to their reality or had been created through some catastrophic event, whether it possessed consciousness or merely hosted conscious entities, whether it could be permanently sealed or only temporarily contained, all these questions demanded answers before effective strategy could be developed. The dimension's temporal stasis, frozen at the moment of first contact, suggested something about its relationship to the gate's opening that no one fully understood. This stasis might represent vulnerability to be exploited or indicate fundamental property of how dimensions interacted that would shape any attempt at permanent separation. Will's continued connection to the Upside Down, his ability to sense Vecna's presence and sometimes perceive the entity's emotional state, made him invaluable for tracking their enemy while placing him at constant risk of possession or manipulation. His artistic expressions of what he sensed, the paintings and drawings that documented his visions, provided others with windows into perceptions they could not directly access. Yet maintaining this connection required Will to keep psychological doors open that safety suggested should be sealed, to remain vulnerable to intrusions that had previously resulted in his complete possession. His willingness to serve as early warning system despite these dangers demonstrated courage, distinct from Elle's psychic battles or Steve's physical confrontations. The group's maturation, from children to young adults, facing apocalyptic stakes transformed their capabilities while introducing complications that younger versions of themselves had not encountered. Mike and Elle's relationship, tested by distance and trauma, required renegotiation now that they were reunited but changed by experiences that had shaped them separately. Lucas's grief over Max combined with guilt about times he had prioritized social acceptance over being present for her struggles. Dustin carried Eddie's loss, the knowledge that someone had died protecting him and would never receive recognition for that sacrifice. Steve continued his evolution from self-centered athlete to protective figure for younger friends, finding purpose in guardianship that his earlier life had not provided. Nancy and Jonathan's relationship faced questions about futures that might not align despite their shared history. Her journalism ambitions and his artistic aspirations, both deferred or compromised by supernatural crises, deserved pursuit, yet seemed incompatible with the commitment required to face Vecna. The tension between personal dreams and collective responsibility, between who they wanted to become and what circumstances demanded they be, affected everyone approaching adulthood while carrying knowledge that prevented normal transitions into independent lives. Hopper and Joyce's reunion, complicated by months of separation and Hopper's traumatic imprisonment, offered possibility of building relationship that previous crises had interrupted. Yet both carried losses that could not be overcome through simple survival. Bob's death remained Joyce's grief, the reminder that loving her placed people in mortal danger. Hopper's time in Russian captivity had left marks both physical and psychological that would require time and support to process. Their capacity to find happiness together while preparing for battle against dimensional threat would test their resilience and commitment. The themes that had defined their journey approached culmination in whatever final confrontation awaited. The found family they had created, bonds forged through shared trauma and demonstrated loyalty, had proven stronger than biological ties for many involved. Elle's relationship with Hopper, Max's with the party, Steve's with Dustin and the younger members all represented chosen connections that superseded conventional family structures. These relationships, built on mutual protection and genuine care, would need to sustain them through trials that would test every bond to breaking. The consistent demonstration that ordinary people could face extraordinary circumstances and prevail through courage rather than inherent superiority provided framework for understanding their role. None possessed special destiny or prophesied importance beyond what they had earned through choices made under pressure. Their victories had come through intelligence, determination, willingness to sacrifice personal interests for collective survival, and refusal to abandon those they loved despite costs. These qualities, available to anyone regardless of supernatural abilities, represented their actual weapons against forces that seemed overwhelmingly powerful. The necessity of acknowledging and processing trauma rather than denying or suppressing it had emerged as survival strategy distinct from military tactics. Max's vulnerability to Vecna had stemmed from unprocessed guilt and depression, her refusal to seek help or share burdens creating psychological openings the entity exploited. Her curse could only be resisted through emotional connection to positive memories and relationships, through music that anchored her to reasons for living. This pattern suggested that whatever final battle occurred would require not just physical courage, but psychological health, that maintaining hope and connection in face of darkness would prove as crucial as any weapon. The cost of victory would likely prove steep, regardless of outcome. Not everyone could be expected to survive confrontation with entity that had existed for decades, that commanded armies of creatures and possessed abilities exceeding their current understanding. The question was not whether sacrifices would be required, but whether those sacrifices would achieve lasting protection for those who survived. Previous victories had been temporary, buying time rather than eliminating threats. The final confrontation needed to accomplish what previous battles had not, to seal dimensional barriers permanently or to destroy Vecna completely, ideally both. The broader world's, the East's, awareness of Hawkins' supernatural struggles remained limited to government agencies and those directly affected. The possibility that the Upside Down's influence might spread beyond one small Indiana town, that other communities might face similar incursions if Hawkins fell, raised stakes beyond personal or local concerns. Whether they fought for their town specifically or for humanity generally, the defenders' determination stemmed from understanding that allowing Vecna's victory was unacceptable regardless of whether others recognized what they prevented. Hopper and Joyce's relationship, Hopper's return from presumed death, Elle's restoration of powers through confronting rather than suppressing her traumatic memories, Will's acceptance of his continued connection to the Upside Down despite his desire for normal life, Mike's evolution from child playing games to young man facing real monsters, Max's fighting spirit even in unconsciousness, Lucas's devotion transcending death itself, Dustin's maintenance of hope and friendship despite accumulated losses, Steve's discovered purpose in protecting others, Nancy's unwillingness to accept easy answers, Jonathan's quiet strength supporting family, Robin's authenticity and intelligence, Erica's surprising courage, Murray's cynical idealism. Each story approached its resolution point. The Upside Down's potential fate ranged from permanent sealing to complete destruction to some form of negotiated coexistence. Whether the dimension could be destroyed without catastrophic effects on their own reality, whether sealing it would hold indefinitely, or merely delay future incursions, whether some symbiotic relationship could be established that allowed both dimensions to exist without mutual destruction, all remained theoretical until attempted. The risk that any solution might prove worse than the problem it addressed required careful consideration, despite urgency. Hawkins itself might not survive in recognizable form. The town's contamination, its scarred landscape, its traumatized population, the economic devastation from evacuation and property destruction, all suggested that even victory against Vecna would leave permanent alterations. Whether the community could rebuild, whether those who had fled would return, whether new residents would move to a town carrying such recent scars, these questions would determine Hawkins' future, assuming it had one. The story approaching its conclusion mirrored the characters who had lived it. What began as simple mystery about a missing boy had evolved into epic spanning dimensions and testing limits of love and courage. The party, formed over basement campaigns, had faced impossible horrors and survived through loyalty, intelligence, and refusal to abandon each other or their home. Their journey from children to young adults fighting for humanity's future demonstrated that extraordinary courage often wore ordinary faces, that heroism emerged from choice rather than destiny, that connection between people mattered more than individual power. The final battle would demand everything they had learned, everyone they had become, and would require sacrifices whose full cost could not yet be calculated. Yet through accumulated darkness, through losses that could never be fully healed, through trauma that would mark them permanently, their connection persevered. This fundamental truth had guided them from the beginning and would carry them through whatever ending awaited. The shadow over Hawkins would either fall completely or be vanquished finally. Either way, the children who had disappeared into woods on bikes, who had hidden a girl with a shaved head, who had fought monsters from another dimension, would emerge changed forever, carrying forward understanding that hope persists even in darkest dimensions, that love transcends death itself, and that ordinary people making extraordinary choices can alter the course of futures that seem predetermined. The history of Hawkins, Indiana, a town that appeared on no traveller's map as destination worth visiting, revealed itself as something far more significant than its modest population or unremarkable geography might suggest. Beneath ordinary streets and within ordinary people resided extraordinary capacity for courage, love, and sacrifice. When confronted with circumstances that exceeded all rational understanding. The timeline we have traced together, from ancient parallel dimensions through the 1980s battles that transformed a small group of friends into defenders of their world, demonstrates truths that transcend specific dates and supernatural events. These are not merely tales of monsters and heroes, but reflections of universal struggles between connection and isolation, between accepting comfortable lies and confronting difficult truths, between surrendering to darkness and choosing hope despite overwhelming reasons for despair. The story of Hawkins has not ended. The final chapters remain unwritten, the ultimate fate of those who have fought so long against impossible odds, yet to be determined. Season 5 approaches with promises of resolution and closure, of battles that will test every lesson learned and every bond forged through shared trauma. Yet what we have explored tonight, the complete timeline from the Upside Down's ancient existence through spring 1986's devastating confrontation, provides foundation for understanding whatever conclusion awaits. The patterns established through their journey suggest that victory, if it comes, will emerge not from superior power, but from the connections between people who refuse to abandon each other, regardless of cost. The children who rode bicycles through safe neighborhoods have become young adults who understand that safety is illusion, that courage means acting despite fear, and that love in all its forms represents humanity's greatest weapon against forces seeking to divide and destroy. Sweet dreams, dear. Sweet listener, may your rest be peaceful, and your own shadows, whatever form they take, prove conquerable through the same courage, friendship, and determination that guided a small town through impossible darkness. The story endures, the timeline continues, but for tonight, let the gentle flow of Hawkins' history carry you into restful sleep. Know that even in dimensions twisted by malevolence, even when gates open between worlds that should remain forever separate, light finds ways to persist through the simple choice to care for one another, to stand together against isolation, and to believe that morning will come despite the longest nights. The tale of Stranger Things reminds us that the extraordinary exists within the ordinary, that heroes emerge from basements and bicycles rather than destiny or prophecy, and that the monsters we face, whether supernatural or painfully human, can be confronted and overcome when we refuse to face them alone.